Hey guys, my name's Kadroth, and today we're going to be going over all of 2024's banners for the NA server. I did this video last year. It was very successful. A lot of people really liked it and thanked me for it. I plan to do it again here, but please understand there's a couple of issues with this year. First and foremost is just the fact that now we have pity on NA, and we're at the point where JP had it as well. So therefore, there's no real adjustments that need to be made. We can assume that banners will happen sort of as they did on JP, which should make it a little bit easier on me. The other major issue here is going to be sort of the fact that this is the point at which JP, due to pity existing, started to really begin to rapid fire a lot of banners out. This was the year on JP where they ended up hitting almost every single SSR who was limited within the same year. The only SSR they didn't get was Benny Enma, and Benny Enma basically had banners to bookend the year right outside of the actual duration of it. For the duration of this banner review, we will be starting partway through the year, and the only reason for that is because I'm getting to recording this pretty late. I was sick earlier in the year, so I just didn't have a whole lot of time to be able to handle this. But now we're actually sitting down as we are awaiting the case files rerun. I have talked about most of that, but we will pretty quickly kind of go through it. Also, this is the year where we're going to start getting advanced quests. I'll probably have a video talking about them as we move forward, but don't worry about it too much. And again, we're just going to kind of kick things off right here. So you guys are pretty much right here with the Koyanskaya of Light campaign. Again, this is sort of the return of Koyanskaya from 6 months ago from Anniversary. You're not going to see another banner for her until basically looking at like November at the end of the year, December, sometime around then. So you have a little bit of time before she will reappear. This is a good opportunity to get her, but probably by the time I actually get this video out, the banner will be over. If you did roll, congratulations. It does have a very nice CE on here called Summer Anniversary. It's all attack scaling. It gives 60% starting charge in MLB, 10% buster up, and even more buster critical damage. So really, really nice. It's a really good CE to have. But regardless of that, it is a very short-lived banner. You guys can expect it to just kind of be done and over with real quick as we start heading into the actual case files event. We did have the Arc 1 improvements campaign at this point on JP, but I think we've already gotten most of these improvements on NA, so I'm not looking for us to actually get this. These happened almost a year ago now at this point, so I kind of expect that they're just kind of skipping over this. Also keep in mind, we do have a shift that normally occurs every single year on NA. This has to do with the timing of our anniversary in relation to how it happened on JP. JP usually celebrates their anniversary at the end of July and early August. NA normally celebrates their anniversary at basically early July. Our true anniversary is actually at the end of June. I'll mention this again as we get closer, but as a result, there usually is a little bit of sort of switching around there, so it just depends as to what's going to happen. But if you see a little bit more of a speed up, a little bit more of a like forward crunch in time on NA, that's usually the reason why, is they're just trying to make room for other stuff to be able to move it around. And that is where we find ourselves with the case files event rerun, as it is coming to NA 2 days early. So we're only on early January at this point, January 10th, and we are already 2 days ahead of JP. So you guys can pretty much just expect this to kind of be carried forward just so that they can use it somewhere else. So let's talk about the actual case files banners, because we do have two. The first one here is going to be Hephaestion. I did talk about her and her servant analysis already. I'm probably not going to end up doing one for Gray, so this will end up having to serve as sort of a hold you over for now. Please understand, Hephaestion's a very good unit. She's the game's first single target pretender. She ends up having 100% charge in her kit. It's really strong, and it does allow her to really kind of pop off. She's also just all around a good quality unit, as she has effectiveness against basically 6 different classes. So she's not quite Nero Beast, but she is kind of getting there in that regard in terms of just being able to be an effective single target nuker for a lot of people. And again, like I said, having that 100% charge is just absolutely stellar for her. Reines, on the other hand, is in a little bit of a weirder spot nowadays. Reines is definitely a very good unit, but I'd say her reign on NA has always been a little bit more short-lived. The reason for this is because even though she is a 50% charging unit now with the buff to her third skill, she ends up in a little bit more of a weird point where she didn't have too much time to actually set herself up and stand apart on NA prior to the release of Castoria. The reason for this is just because Castoria ended up coming out on NA about a month sooner than she did on JP, but also due to the fact of NA having clairvoyance, we knew Castoria was right around the corner. Whereas on JP, they had no idea she was coming. She absolutely blindsided them and came out of left field. So when Reines got that buff that gave her 50% charge and then got the banner there, I think a lot of people went, oh, hey, that's a really good unit. I'm going to go out of my way to get her. She's still a really good unit. In fact, comparing her to someone like, say, Waver, the difference is they're both 50% charging units, but Reines ends up being a unit that kind of has a little bit more offensive capability for a single unit, whereas Waver's a little bit better for the party. And what do I mean by that? I mean that Waver actually provides attack up and defense up to the entire party. Reines provides defense up to the entire party, but her attack is focused. The Waver gives 30% attack to everybody, so he's definitely going to be a little bit better for multi-damage dealer types of setups, versus Reines, who's going to be a lot better with a like focused looper type of setup where you're just pumping everything onto one unit. And the reason for that is because her attack up is a single target 40% attack up for 3 turns. So really a strong capability, but that's where again she differs from Waver. Obviously, there's a bunch of other different points, but if you like Reines, or again, you just need a good 50% charger, Reines is a good option for you. She is a limited unit, so you will have to roll in order to get her. Those of you that are worried about rolling more of her because of Hephaestion, certainly that's a thing, but she does end up having a decent NP that has, as of this point, gotten an NP interlude. And so the big thing to understand is as you get more NP levels, this will begin to increase the amount of defense down that you're getting with her NP. So it's not going to have a huge effect, but certainly you could get quite a bit more defense out of this. Definitely for those of you guys that have ever used, say, Waver's NP, you might see the same use for someone like Reines. I think the only difference, though, is that Reines is a little bit less of a stall option, whereas Waver, you're somewhat incentivized to use his NP because not only does he do the defense down, but he can also stun the enemies and drain them, acting as, again, that sort of stall aspect to a unit. But in that regard, Reines has other nice things like Overcharge and Cleanse that she has, but it's not too much really to write home about. It can be nice in certain select situations, especially the ability to ignore class advantage on every unit in the party, but outside of that, it really is not that big of a deal. So I understand people being concerned about getting multiple MP levels of Reines. Please just bear that in mind, that it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but it ultimately comes down to getting to Reines' NP, and I think that's kind of the big thing that everyone should consider. Obviously, there are some decent CEs on this, but nothing too much, so we're not going to spend really any major time talking about them. Banner number 2, on the other hand, though, is going to have, ironically enough, Waver and then Astraea. So in comparison to Reines, as we already talked about, Waver has, in my opinion, the overall probably better NP, and then definitely a lot better if you're trying to work on, again, multi-damage dealer setups. But if you're just going with the devoted person handling all 3 waves, Reines will be your better pick in order to just, buff them from that standpoint. Reines can also split up her charge a little bit better, as she ends up having 2 20% charges and a 10% charge. Waver has 2 10% charges and a 30% charge. So that block of 30 sometimes is just a little bit clunky for people to use, but it really just depends on who you're working with and the charge increments that you find yourself at. Again, though, I think Waver, even after all these years, still really holds up. He's a unit that you guys can get off the SSR ticket when you begin the game, and he is sort of my go-to choice for stuff like that, but it really does just depend on how you want to handle things. Again, if you're someone that doesn't have him, I do think he can actually be a good, useful unit to you. He is not the most, OP or broken or power creep type of unit nowadays. It's the same thing with Reines, because what both of those supports are good for is actually being able to support every party type, not being specific to a single card type like, say, Scotty or Koyanskaya or even Castoria are. So that's where, again, having these units can definitely be to your advantage at certain points in time, where you either need a mix and match or you just, have some sort of weird need for like different units with different NP types. And that definitely can happen depending on the node. But still, I do really like Waver. I think he's well worth your attention if you don't already have him. And that should kind of be apparent at this point. But he is a permanent unit. And in that degree, so is Astraea. Now, we did just on JP end up having Nagao Kagatora 2.0 come out, aka Weiseki Kenshin. She is a fantastic single target ruler. And, that was my concern when it was first coming out that she was arts. I was like, I need to see these damage numbers because Astraea is a unit that just does a ton of damage for all of you. She absolutely can pop off, not just when in niche, but even just in normal use. And she has a very synergistic kit to help that. She's always been sort of that go-to single target ruler, because not only have we not had 5-star single target rulers until Nagao Kagatora, but we also just really, didn't have anyone that compared damage-wise. The closest thing was Martha Ruler, and she, while she has had upgrades, definitely, in terms of her average performance, didn't really hold up. I think Astraea being arts also was a little bit of a feather in her cap, as it just made getting back to subsequent MPs a lot easier. So she is a really solid option for you guys. She's definitely pickable on things like the 4-star ticket. And I think one of the big things that really, speaks to me is that anti-evil niche that she has, as well as the ability to invuln pierce. So you're not really going to ever stop her from doing what she wants to do. And definitely she is going to be able to hit hard with regards to that overcharge effect. So having a super effective mod against evil enemies, there's a ton of evil enemies out there in the game. Obviously, this is going to be a little bit more effective against, servants that are actually going to have the evil alignment. But it is a thing that I think a lot of people should consider, is that this can, absolutely weigh in for a lot of boss killing. You don't have to, roll for higher NP levels of her either. She could be effective even at NP 1 for people. So I do think Astraea is a really, really good pickup. And with regards to Weiseki Kenshin existing in the future, I really don't think it matters too much. I think as you start to look towards that, you're either going to already have Astraea and be like, well, I'm content with her, or you're just going to want Weiseki Kenshin anyways and go after that, because the big thing that Weiseki Kenshin's going to do is she's going to remove buffs. And that's really, really nice for her as well. So that means not only just like, stuff like invuln and such that Astraea could carve through, but even things like guts, she's going to be able to remove so that you don't have to really worry about it. Still, they're definitely different units. They're both very strong units. So don't feel like you have to go with one or the other, because again, it can just absolutely help you. But that's the Case Files event rerun. The second banner had the same CEs. I'm also not really expecting the Arc 1 Improvements campaign for Part 3, or again, the Prison Tower stuff. But hey, we may get it. And if we do, let's go ahead and talk about these units and kind of where they stand. So, again, you guys can see this is where we did get a Da Vinci's Workshop update. And there's nothing too much to write home about here. But essentially, you guys should have a rate up for both Dantes and Nightingale. Talking about Dantes, at this point, I see a lot of sort of disdain, especially on NA, for Quick. I think a lot of this has to do with where JP has been for the past 2 years and where it's headed. I really want to see people kind of try out Quick even more, try to actually get Scotty and her different forms and help out their Quick comps. Because I think that's a huge issue with it, is a lot of people just don't have the proper supports for their Quick comps, and that's why they think Quick is bad. Quick is still certainly very good. It's obviously got some issues with how many support options it has. It has some issues maybe with how the system functions overall. But at the end of the day, it's still really good, and there are situations where it can 5 and 6 slot with CEs. Dantes is going to be one of those situations. He can absolutely start from 0, even as a quick unit, especially thanks to his charge upgrade that he already has early here on NA. So this should really help your considerations for using him in that regard. And remember, there is also Oberon that's out there to help pick up the slack in any sort of quick comp where the unit just doesn't refund that much. But Dantes is not one of those units. Dantes has a very, very clean kit. He's got Ignore Invincibility. He ends up having that charge skill that we talked about and the ability to cleanse himself and gain crit stars. So there's really not too much that I think you have a concern with other than the fact that he is quick. He is a unit that also hits pretty hard nowadays. He has managed to get a lot of love over time, including his NP interlude, and I think as you start comparing him to units like, say, Space Ishtar, or again, other more recent units like, say, Nero Alter or something like that, there are plenty of AoE Avenger options nowadays. The good news is for the SSRs, most of them can 3-turn now, and they're really pretty solid. I think Dantes is meant to be sort of the quick answer to Space Ishtar and how strong she had gotten. And we've kind of seen this as well, where they've kind of come up with an arts and a buster option with both Nobu Avenger as well as Kama Avenger. So each one of them, I think, is meant to represent a particular card type where they slightly edge out Space Ishtar within their niche. But otherwise, Space Ishtar is a good all-rounder and certainly awesome. So you don't have to feel bad about her. But again, don't write off these other units, especially if you're someone that just happens to be sitting on them, or you're maybe thinking about rolling them because you just like the way they are. Dantes is one of those units. I think a lot of people didn't originally plan to roll Dantes. Then they got into the tower event. They were like, he's actually pretty cool. And then they see his animations. They're like, I actually like his animations. And it kind of changed their mind on him. Be careful, because Dantes may be about to change your mind, but certainly he is not a bad unit even in current year on JP. That cannot, however, be said for Nightingale. Nightingale is a unit that I think is largely behind the times at this point. She still has quite a bit of niche usefulness. She's never been a meta support unit or anything like that. But I think the biggest issues that we have with Nightingale lie in how her kit functions nowadays and the fact that she is a berserker. And the reason for that is because it's very difficult to have a support berserker because of how squishy they are. You start trying to take them into sort of long-term combat, and it can become a real concern when you have everybody being effective against a class. So I do think they've done some stuff to help out with that, especially the second skill right here that increases her defense and damage against humanoid enemies. Humanoid is the big wide niche, so that impacts a lot of stuff. However, it's still only 25% defense. I do think that, really that's kind of the big issue with Nightingale is a lot of her stuff just really needs upgrades and attention. Her Nurse of Steel skill has gotten its upgrade. She does get debuff immunity and instant kill immunity for at least the one time there. The debuff immunity, however, is 3 times, which is really, really nice for units like, say, Fran Berserker, if you're trying to loop her or something like that. Anyone that can stun themselves in a negative aspect, you can, ironically enough, if they have enough charge, work in Nightingale to work. But Nightingale originally evolved as a sort of challenge support and as sort of a buster stat stick, basically for people that lacked Merlin or when he originally wasn't out. They have kind of come back and revisited this. Sadly, I don't think these buffs actually really help Nightingale's usefulness. I do think there are still people out there that use her. I don't think she's unusable or anything like that. I just think that kind of the biggest issue with her is that her main niche is somewhat already met in a much safer way. That is to say, Nightingale's NP had the ability to reduce all enemies' attacks by 50% for 1 turn. That's actually really powerful. That's really going to dramatically reduce the amount of damage coming into your party. The problem is, in an era of Castoria, it's better to outright prevent damage than to try and weather it. So this is kind of the issue that we run into when we start thinking about Nightingale, is she just winds up being a riskier option. Especially if you don't end up having enough defense and healing to kind of live outside of the 1 turn duration here, you end up having quite a bit of problems. And Also, Nightingale does reduce NP damage as well on top by 50%. So if it's an NP you're about to get hit with, those two effects combined, you can really reduce the amount of damage. It still might not save you, and that's sort of the problem that you run into, is the fact that bosses have numerous different weird effects that they can use to try and kill you, and it may just be the fact that you land a stray crit on someone like Nightingale herself, and then your whole run tanks. I'm not saying there's nothing you can do about this. I think a good master can figure out how to use Nightingale effectively. That being said, I'd say even the dumbest masters can figure out how to use Castoria effectively, and so it ends up being sort of a usability argument where it's just safer and easier to go with better options that are newer. Nightingale needs some love, and she needs it in a hurry. She is one of the units, I think, at this point that is most affected by the recent meta changes in the past couple of years that have occurred on both NA and JP. She desperately needs some love. So I don't really recommend rolling for her right now, sadly, because, again, the devs have not done what they need to allow Nightingale to succeed and stand out in a niche of her own. Now that is the Prison Tower event. Again, there's no CEs or anything on this one, so nothing too much that we have to worry about. We should have an Arjuna and KARNA summoning campaign here. This one just kind of was a one-off. Again, you can kind of see when we have a campaign that is just for the purpose of giving you a banner for 2 units and not to celebrate anything or any real life event that's going on. This is what started to happen on JP. They started to just really shotgun the banners out. And this is what makes it so hard to actually keep all of this in your head nowadays. I used to be able to be someone that could memorize all of the banners and just kind of be able to regurgitate the info like that. There's too many banners nowadays in the past 2 years for me to be able to remember accurately when some of them are. I do remember most of the important ones off the top of my head, but there are plenty that, just kind of slip through the cracks over time. Regardless, we have both Arjuna and KARNA coming up right here. Now, again, we got another DaVinci Workshop update for costumes. This was a year where they started trying to give us a lot of costumes for free if you had done certain things. So again, anyone that had cleared E Pluribus Unum would get Arjuna's sort of anniversary costume without any rare prism cost. And if you had already purchased it, you would get the cost refunded to you. So it was kind of nice in that regard. Now, let's not talk about his costume, but let's talk about him himself. The joke has for a long time been that the devs just forgot about Arjuna in favor of releasing a new version of him. Seemingly their, darling has been Arjuna Alter because of how strong they made him. But Arjuna himself is not weak, and I have held the stance for a long time, and I still hold it to this day, that Arjuna is just sort of a man that's caught in a class of monsters. It's not that he's bad, it's that everybody else is so good with regards to the AoE archers. And the big problem that Arjuna ends up having is sort of the clunkiness of his kit. He has debuff immunity for 5 turns, which is actually pretty solid. He ends up having 25% charge and then 10% charge per turn. This wasn't a good buff as far as I'm concerned. It definitely helps him with stuff like challenge content, and it does help push him over the edge for kind of what you needed out of him from a charge standpoint, but it still doesn't really let him work too well, and it doesn't really end up helping out his sort of issues when being compared to some of his other counterparts. So this is kind of the point that I like to make to people, is that he's not bad, he's certainly usable, and actually if you go look at his numbers, he can be used quite effectively. So if you happen to be sitting on an NP3 Arjuna or something like that, I've seen it happen before in my account reviews and such, it's actually possible that Arjuna might be your strongest AoE archer that you have at the moment. But again, it really just depends on how many copies you've managed to have rolled for him. Otherwise, I'm pretty much going to recommend that you guys work with certain other units. And a big part of that is the overall clunkiness of the kit, which again, third skill is very nice, but outside of that, I think you start looking at the NP and you start to really begin to see what the issue at play is. He's got instant kill procs on his NP. He deals damage to all enemies and then has a 50% chance to instant kill them, and then an 80% chance to instant kill divine enemies on top of that. Problem is, a lot of the times you're going up against servants, and this just doesn't matter. You're probably not going to land a death proc on any servant that exists in the game. This just has to do with how death proc works and sort of the calculations from the player's side versus the sort of AI's side. The NPCs will often have much higher death resistance compared to them trying to death proc you, in which you have none, and they will just immediately kind of land that and make you suffer. So this is sort of the issue at play. Death ends up largely being a meme for most players, and yet not a meme at all for the AI trying to death proc you. Again, it is what it is. I think you can definitely look at how his NP used to be and see that even they felt like this was rather weak and that it needed to be upgraded. The problem is, even still, it is a trait qualified increase to instant death chance. That's kind of one of the big issues with it too. So it's not like he has more damage against divine enemies. That would actually be better for him. He just ends up having extra divinity proc. I think that's not that good. And so this is sort of the issue that I would like to see in a weird way. I almost think you could give Arjuna Alter Arjuna, not Arjuna Alter. You could almost give Arjuna a third NP interlude, and that would actually help him out a ton. The problem is, if you actually gave him a third NP interlude, his damage would become insane then, and I mean, I'm not going to say it wouldn't be good for him, it would. It just probably would not be good for the rest of the AoE archers at that point. So it is what it is, but they definitely need to really think about their design choices in the future with a unit like Arjuna. Then we have KARNA. Now, KARNA has recently gotten some good love. I think the only issue whenever we talk about KARNA is now the issue at play with all AoE Lancers. And that just winds up being basically your Melissan issue. The fact that Melissan is as strong as she is and can do everything from 0% starting charge, definitely causing a bit of a Space Ishtar type issue with your Lancers. That is to say, there's not much reason to ever use any other Lancer, especially for AoE purposes, when she just ends up being stronger than most people even in their niche. It's not a good thing to have. I do think they need to equalize this sub, so they need to really start looking at their AoE Lancers and how they can bring them into parity, because not many of them can touch things like Black Grail. So they need to really start amping the damage if they want, you know, the other AoE Lancers to compete with Melissan. KARNA is a unit that has always actually been really good on damage. He's got anti-divine niche, and that really does work for him. Unlike Arjuna, who just increases his death proc against divine, KARNA actually ends up having a really good NP that basically has super effective modifier against divine. This really helps out his damage capability. Unlike Arjuna Alter, however, he gets the Buster Resist down, but it's after his damage goes out, not before. So this also sort of somewhat impacts his capability, but again, it is what it is. I do think he's gotten some nice upgrades here with his third skill. This really helped him out. They gave him exactly what he needed, and I found it really funny because I remember when this came out, a lot of people either thought this buff was very middling or like it just wasn't strong, when the reality was this buff was exactly what KARNA needed. Gave him a Star Bomb, it basically improved his crit damage here, and it ends up giving him a much nicer charge skill that actually can function fluidly in the Koyanskaya setup. So I do think KARNA's in a much better spot. We can talk all about Melissan's damage at the end of the day, but you can 3-turn with KARNA with double Koyanskaya and Oberon, start him with a good 50% C, and that really does help out his damage quite a bit. At the end of the day, if one of the units is stronger, it is what it is, but it doesn't make KARNA bad, and that's the important thing to take away from. Obviously, if you're someone that just wants the best unit in the game of any class, you're going to be going after Melissan. Obviously, if you're someone that just really likes Melissan, you're going to be going after Melissan. But for all the rest of you out there, KARNA is still a really, really solid unit, and again, I do think he actually does hold up well now thanks to that buff. Definitely not the case with his brother in arms, Arjuna, but hey, it is what it is. So again, we had the Arc 1 Improvements Campaign Part 2. Like I said, I don't know that you get this, but you should probably, sorry, this is part 4. You should probably end up getting the banner. And the reason why is because I cannot imagine that people are not going to scream if you don't get a planned Eresh and Ishtar banner. If they don't do that, people are going to get really angry at the devs. So it is what it is. Now, that being said, again, remember, this is exactly how it functioned on JP. You guys can expect it to function the same way. The dates may change. It may be what it may be. But you do actually have Starry Nights, which is a fairly good craft essence here. This one is a 5-star CE that is all attack scaling. It basically is starting battle at 50% gauge when it's MLB, critical damage by 15%, and buster performance by 15%. So it's not got NP damage up or anything like that, but it does have the buster up, and it does have crit damage on top of that. Definitely a nice CE for those of you guys that may have to rely on carding power. So again, not a bad one to actually acquire if I'm going to point some of them out. Now, we just got done talking about KARNA versus Melisande, so it would behoove me to talk about Ereshkigal, because Ereshkigal is another unit that started out relatively on the polar opposite end from Melisande. Eresh used to be the worst damage dealing AoE SSR Lancer, and the big reason for this just had to be with how her kit worked and the fact that Eresh already had some supportive capabilities. I don't think the devs really ever intended for her to be, knockdown, drag out damage. And I think that kind of was reflected by the fact that they just ignored her for years and years and years. They're still ignoring her, I guess, with regards to giving her a summer form, but that's besides the point. The point that I'm trying to make here is that I think this always was their intent, was to keep her as more of a pseudo support type of unit that's really good in challenge scenarios, in servant wave type of battles where you gotta just go up against multiple servants in a row. But I do think that that is why they eventually saw that Melisande was going to be coming out. They knew the amount of capability that Melisande was going to have, and so I think they preemptively buffed Eresh to really just help with this, and I do think it does help. I think giving her super effective damage against Earth is awesome for her, and it definitely helps her stand out. This is design that I think benefits FGO the most, is when you actually give your units proper niches so that you can sit here and go, well, my unit is good, but they're even better in their niche, and that is where I'm going to take them. And then if you have another competing unit that has a different niche, you use them during that point in time. And so that's where, to me, they can have everybody be relatively on a decently same playing field. It doesn't have to be exact point for point, but it definitely helps them out, and it allows people to have multiple reasons to roll different units, and it allows people to be able to really take pride in the units that they do have, and understand that they will be good and outperform other units in certain cases. Problem is, we still have Melisande, and yes, even with super effective Earth trait, Melisande probably will outdamage Eresh. Again, a lot of that is just that synergy with Oberon and Black Grail, but it is what it is. Still, giving her this damage upgrade was sorely needed. It's definitely helped her leapfrog Lartoria finally, and actually get her in a much nicer place, and now she is one of the better AoE Lancers with regards to damage output, assuming she is in niche. So again, I do think Eresh is a pretty solid unit. She's a 50% buster charging AoE Lancer. That's kind of always going to be a solid, good unit. Now we get to talk about Ishtar. And Ishtar is another unit that I think, has seen her time in the sun. It's kind of come, kind of gone. And it's been back and forth between her and Gil as to sort of who our go-to best AoE archer is. For a long period in time, it was Gil, then it was Ishtar again, then it was Gil again, then it was Ishtar again, and now it's kind of back to Gil on rotation on JP. Does that mean that Ishtar has seen her time in the sun and is kind of done being top dog? Maybe. It just depends on whether or not they want to buff her again. I think they actually like that sort of dichotomy that they have with Gil, and the fact that they kind of, can sit there and have them upend each other almost as if their lore had them in arguments or something like that. But regardless, I do have to point out the fact that Ishtar, even if she's not the top, has always been a strong candidate. Because Gil derives a lot of his power from his ability to damage servants, Ishtar doesn't. Ishtar has just always been flat, even across the board, good and solid. She's good against servants and good against non-servants. So she has that aspect going for her. She is a 50% charging AoE buster unit. Like I said, that's pretty much always going to result in a fairly solid unit. Her third skill is also really good because of cooldown reductions being a thing in the buster system. This allows you to basically pop it every single turn if you want it. Obviously, it's got that delayed impact, so not much you can do about that. And you cannot double pop it in the same turn, unfortunately. Just be careful if you're trying to do that. But yes, I think Ishtar holds up amazingly well nowadays. Getting that NP interlude really helped her out. And honestly, the 20 crit star bomb on the back end of it is really solid for a unit that has sneakily powerful crits from time to time. Not just because of her attack up, but also, again, because of the party crit damage that she ends up having on her first skill here. So I do think both of these units are certainly worth your time. Just keep in mind they do have a little bit of a staggered banner release. So yes, there will be a point in time that they're both on rate up, but certainly it's going to depend on how much you want to go after them. And Avalon here wanted to point out, by the way, that during this Arc 1 improvements campaign for Part 4, we are supposed to get basically the free access to the Merry Christmas from the Underworld event. This is Altera the Santa. It's her event where she's the welfare. So what it means is that it will no longer cost rare prisms for you guys. So if you want to buy it, it's completely free as long as you've completed Babylonia. But then also, again, for those of you guys that have already purchased it, it will refund the amount to your gift box. So you're going to start to see that as, again, throughout this year, they really start making more and more stuff for free. And I do think that's going to help it out. As we start heading into basically what amounts to February here, we end up with the Valentine's pre-release campaign that came out on JP. And again, remember, this is with pity in mind, so expect that each one of them is going to have their own day in the sun. You can see they kind of did this rotation of 3-day banners for a lot of people. Expect that to also be the case. I don't really like how JP does the scheduled graphics, but it kind of always has been this way. So let's go ahead and talk about our servants that are on rate up. But again, you guys can see we do end up having various craft essences with them, so I'm going to try to take a break in between to talk about each. So first up is going to be Nero Bride, and Nero Bride I think is an awesome unit, and I'm going to explain why. Not only does she not care whether or not you're quick or arts, but she can kind of fit in just about any comp if you just need a little bit of extra charge. That 30% charge upgrade that they gave her really absolutely helped propel her into this sort of what I like to call the tertiary support role. And that just kind of means she's really awesome as a third support in a double Scotty or double Castoria setup. If you don't want to have to use Oberon, maybe just because you don't need the firepower, you don't want to risk, bricking the unit when you press the third skill at the wrong time, or maybe you just don't want to bond him. That can be a thing. And in fact, speaking of bonds, since we know that the JP devs have already come out and said that they don't really have any plans to go to Bond 20, and that basically their stance is that you should roll other units, I think this is a good feather in the cap of Nero Bride. This does mean that if you take, like, say, a support Castoria and then bring your own Nero Bride in place of your Castoria, there's still a lot of comps that can get done. And this is an important thing to denote because it can save you a ton of bond. If you're someone that's worried about fast tracking your Castoria to bond 15 and then basically having to bench her, which again, you don't have to do, but certainly there are concerns with using a bond 15 unit and your overall bond efficiency, I do think that a unit like Nero Bride can really help you. Again, she's got a lot of stuff in her kit. Basically, due to her upgrades, she has 30% targetable charge and 45% NP gain for 3 turns for a unit. 40% attack up for 3 turns, which is as strong as Reines, as we were denoting before, and then critical star generation rate. And then again, now she also has a sky attribute power mod of 30% that she can target onto people for 3 turns. So really, really a solid setup. The thing I really have always liked about Nero Bride is the fact that her skills can either be selfish or selfless. She can either put them on herself or on someone else, which just means they're flexible. It means you have the choice, and that's always the sign of a good skill when you have the choice, and it can be used on, again, your unit or the damage dealing unit, depending on what you need. Obviously, she's had quite a bit of work done, basically not only getting a NP interlude to her actual damage output, but also to her burn output. This was something I think kind of needed to happen because her burn damage was pretty pathetic. It's still not that strong in all honesty, but it is what it is. That being said, I have a tendency to remind people that, you know, for years, Nero Bride was perceived to be on par with a lot of other single target sabers for damage output. The reality was Nero Bride has always been a pseudo support unit, and the only reason that she managed to hang with people in terms of damage had to deal with the fact that for a long period in time, Nero Bride was the only single target SSR saber that had an NP interlude. Now that we started to see the other single target sabers get NP interludes, yeah, they definitely can out damage her. Still, that Sky niche can come into play and really help her out, so it just depends on what you're looking for. But I'm gonna say she won't be the strongest single target saber for you, but she will be probably your most used single target saber if you start considering use in other comps. So I do think she's a very solid option for you guys, and while I wouldn't necessarily quite call her a meta support, she's definitely right on the cusp of that, especially given that bond stance that the devs have. Next up, we end up having MHX Alter. MHX Alter is fantastic. Echan, as we like to call her, has gotten a lot of upgrades as well over the years. She's definitely a unit that I think is suffering a little bit under the quick umbrella, but this just has to do with the fact that she's a unit in, you know, current day and age that does not have any charge whatsoever. Charge is very meta, and it really helps like sort of automate things and make it, you know, foolproof and sure that you will be able to do what you need to do. So while you don't have a charge skill on Echan, you trade this basically for more firepower. Echan hits very hard, especially in her niches. She's gotten a lot of upgrades over time, including giving her quite a bit of extra crit damage to all of card types for herself. And again, she ends up having quick up on her second skill, and then basically the ability to increase the party's attack. The only thing she doesn't really have is hard survivability. She does get a little bit of healing over time with that first skill, but nothing too much. And that's where, again, you're going to have to be concerned about the fact that she doesn't have charge and she's squishy. But again, she will trade this for damage output, as with her NP interlude, she gets the ability to increase her damage against good alignment enemies for 1 turn. That hint right there of 1 turn means this is a power mod. So it's not as strong as super effective, but it's still very good to have. She's got a 50% 1-turn power mod, and again, this will impact her cards then after her NP against good alignment enemies. She then deals damages to 1 enemy and then deals super effective damage to any unit that is a Saber class servant. So it does have the classification of it needing to be a servant, but yeah, if you manage to have a good aligned Saber, of which there are plenty, she will slaughter them in terms of damage. And again, you don't even need that, just due to the fact she has the NP interlude. Her damage has already been pretty stellar, even at something like NP1. So having, you know, even one of the niches in play is really going to help out her damage, as she can hit some pretty psychotic numbers. Obviously, refund's going to be a little bit of a concern, but if you're going boss killing and bar breaking, you're probably going to get some cards on the back end of that to help out with that. So it's really not too big of a concern, but it definitely can stop you from 3-turning every now and then. Still, I can't extol her virtues enough as somebody that has a very powerful one, but I can definitely tell you that even at NP1, which I had for years on JP, she is still very solid as a unit. Now, here we have Cute Orangette, which is going to be a CE on her banner. This one is a excellent challenge CE, and the reason being is because it's all attack scaling, and then it has NP gen and NP damage up, basically kind of helping a unit out over time. So it doesn't have that starting charge that you're used to crutching on. Instead, it has things that are going to help you perpetually down the stretch. This is a great CE for fights that are going to go much longer than 3 turns, where, hey, just having that NP generation rate in perpetuity is really going to help that card performance. Having that NP damage in perpetuity, really going to help that NP pop off and hit those break bar points. So again, Q-Dar and Jet has always been a strong CE and definitely is pretty solid. It's not the most taken CE because most of the time you don't need it, but if you do need it, it is very good. Next up is Semiramis. Now, if you guys have paid attention to me the past couple days, I have talked about Semiramis somewhat. She has been a very interesting unit. There's been rumors for a while that, you know, people on JP don't like her, that there's some sort of issue within the JP community for how they feel about her and kind of her dealings with Amakusa and such. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not sure whether or not that's even true or here nor there for the most part. But it may explain the relative lack of attention, if that's the case, that Semiramis has gotten. That is to say, Semiramis has really not received any of her due diligence. All she has gotten is an NP interlude. And yet, we've got Gray coming out right here with, again, an NP interlude of her own that just makes her absolutely trounce the damage output of Semiramis. That's not a good thing. And yes, you can certainly make a Semiramis out damage a Gray if you manage to have a bunch of NP levels of her, but I don't think that's the most solid of issues with her. I think at the end of the day, her kit just ends up being rather clunky. She does have 30% charge, which thanks to mana loading and the Koyanskaya system means, yeah, you can absolutely get back to this and absolutely be able to 3-turn with her. And again, you know, as we start talking like Oberon numbers, obviously this is going to be able to handle, you know, low tier nodes and stuff like that. 90, even 90 plus content should be doable with a NP1 Semiramis. But it's not going to cut it in 90 plus plus content. You don't have to do 90 plus plus content for the most part. You could definitely say, hey, I don't need the, you know, extra stress or, you know, kind of desire to wail from doing 90 plus plus content and just do 90 plus for a good majority of the time. The efficiency is relatively the same for most people because it's very difficult to squeeze more efficiency out of a 90 plus plus node since it requires such a heavy burden of buffing, and really the only real way to do it is to be able to 6-slot the node, which is difficult for most people as it tends to, you know, take account of like damage bonus and such in events. So as a result, most people end up 5-slotting a 90 plus plus node, making them not that, you know, basically same in terms of efficiency with a 90 plus. If that's the case, you don't have to care too much about 90 plus plus, other than doing, you know, maybe the one run for a clear. So talking about it all the time is neither here nor there. But still, I think we have concerns with Semiramis, because again, she basically ends up having the increased attack and defense advantage against caster class for 3 turns that we just saw with Hephaestion. The issue at play here is this is an assassin, so when those 3 turns are up, your unit's probably dead. At least in Hephaestion's case, that unit is not like super effective against her or anything like that, so you definitely have at least that level of advantage, and this is something that I think is worth denoting. Still, you end up with her 3rd skill here, and she still has not received an upgrade to this skill. We have seen Moriarty get buffs. We've seen Kukulkan come out now on JP where she has the ability to spend stars. And still, Semiramis requires and consumes stars in order to be able to use her 3rd skill. Thankfully, nowadays, with our Koyanskaya and Oberon setups, having enough stars, not a problem. It's just kind of clunky and annoying, and it really shouldn't be the case anymore at this point, given that everybody else that had skills like this has pretty much seen them get phased out. I think to me that was an admission of the devs, you know, guilt and failure in the process of trying to implement a system that spent stars. It doesn't mean that they couldn't come out with units that did. Again, you look at you look at Kukulkan and you know that they can do it properly. I think it's just an issue of the fact that they really just haven't gone back and looked at Semiramis, and that's why I wonder if she's just getting neglected at this point. Because as far as I'm concerned, she just does not hold up to her counterparts, to her contemporaries within the AoE SSR tier of servant there. She really is getting, at this point, passed by some 4 stars, and she really needs to be looked at again. You have Pharaoh Kokolotl. This one is all attack scaling and NP gen, NP damage, and buster up. It's definitely not a bad CE, but certainly with a lot of your Buster units, you're probably not going to be trying to card it out because they're not exactly known for their NP generation. That definitely has the NP gen there to help, but it is, to me, a rather odd CE in that regard. Next up, we've got Murasaki. Murasaki, I feel like, is still a very solid unit. Casters are a little bit in a weird place. I feel like we've got some crazy damage output from some of our other units out there in the game. Again, you've heard me talk about Kukulkan, Melissan already, but I think the big monster in the closet for the time being, especially for our cavalry classes, is Tiamat. Tiamat has come out at this point and does more damage in 1.5 times effectiveness than most units do in 2 times effectiveness. That's not a good situation for them to be in. It really helps sell Tiamat, and it really helps hurt the desire for anyone to roll anyone not named Tiamat in the caster, assassin, or rider classes. So I do think that that's something that they need to start looking at, is taking a damage pass for how much damage their casters do as a whole. We do have some really good options there. I'd say Murasaki is not one of the worst ones, and she does have a very applicable niche, because again, she ends up being anti-demonic. So as far as I'm concerned, having super effective modifier against one of the biggest niches in the game, not a bad thing. That's really going to help her out, especially when we start talking about how certain classes have tendencies towards certain things. There's definitely a lot of demonic assassins out there. So yes, this will actually be somewhat useful for her compared to someone like, say, Sieg, who you'll get via the Evocation Festival, who ends up not really having nearly as useful of a niche. Sieg is still really good and usable as a unit, but I do think that is sort of the issue. Still, I think the big reason that a lot of people will want Murasaki, besides just her overall attractiveness, will end up being the fact that she can increase the party's buff removal resistance by 100% for 1 time over 3 turns. This means you get 3 turns of coverage to see if the AI is going to attempt to remove buffs from you. That could be someone like, say, Amakusa firing off his NP, or that could be something as simple as Jack just trying to spam her buff removal skill on you. So it's really a solid ability to have, as it's just going to stop the party from being interrupted by the enemy. Again, buff removal resistance is somewhat hard to get, and there's not a whole lot of units that do provide it. Bini Inma ends up being my go-to unit for single targets that gives it. Murasaki is not a bad one for AoE in that regard. So I have to point this out, that she is a rather solid unit. And even though Semiramis can give it to herself, Semiramis ends up in a much weirder place as compared to Murasaki because of this. So I think being an arts looping caster, someone that can start from 0, Murasaki ends up being pretty solid. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Bittersweet here. It's, again, all attack scaling and invincibility for 2 attacks with NP damage of 30%. There's a whopping amount of NP damage there, considering it also has the sort of Volumen-like effect of granting invincibility for 2 attacks. The very weird hybrid C, I wouldn't necessarily roll for it, but if you are an Ishtar and Ereshkigal simp, you're probably going to go after it. Next up, we've got Sei Shonagon. She is definitely an interesting unit nowadays, as obviously units like Oberon coming into the game have really helped out some of our less refunding quick units. And what do I mean by that? I mean, Sei's refund actually sucks. It's one of the worst ones out there for quick units. It's definitely something that I think like they purposefully restricted because of her overall strength of her kit. She has the ability to charge the party's NP gauge. She ends up having quick up of 3 turns and a self evasion of 3 attacks 3 turns, and then ends up topping all of that off with 3 different, between neutral, Shadow Servant, and man attribute niches that really work for her. Sei actually has a very solid kit. So they naturally kept her refund low since her damage was going to be good and her kit was going to be good. I'm not aggravated by that in the slightest. I completely understand it. You can't have one unit have everything. That being said, certainly if you wanted to 3-turn with a unit like Sei, you needed some help. And that's where Oberon coming in can really work out. There may be some situations that you can pull off with double Summer Scotty and Oberon, but again, I think there's going to be certain situations where you're just going to want to do double Oberon and a Summer Scotty in order to make Sei actually pop off. So do I think Sei is really solid nowadays? I don't think she's your strongest AoE archer by any means, unless you just get all of the stars to align on those niches. But I do think she's pretty serviceable and very good in a challenge fight. And so as a result, I think with Oberon coming into the game, you definitely have the capability to 3-turn with her, even if it's not going to be the strongest. So I do think Sei is definitely what I would call serviceable nowadays. So she's not bad, she's not the best, but she is definitely an option for a lot of people. That is going to be the pre-banner for Valentine's Day. If you thought we were done there, then now we go into actual Valentines. And basically, before we talk about the actual servants, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that this is where Karen will actually get her NP interlude. This is going to really help Karen's damage out, and she is going to be quite a bit of a monster with regards to her Black Grail numbers. Let's go ahead and talk about the servants on Raid Up here. I'm going to end up covering a lot, so this is going to end up being a long segment, but obviously, to start out with, let's talk about Bazett herself. Bazett comes into the game, and I think, we had her teased ahead of time. We knew she was coming. We kind of theorized that she would have a NP somewhat like Angry Mango, but I don't think anyone expected it to be as good as it is, because it is absolutely stellar. I've heard rumors that a lot of time attack people have had to split into a new category for Bazett because of her unique capability to be able to actually kill fights faster than any other unit. And the reason for this is because Bazett can pop a bar with her own attacks and then manage to actually, counter the next bar down. So she ends up having a really easy time basically blitzing through things as long as the stars align for her. She can be very strong. She's not going to be able to solo everything in the game. She's not going to be able to, withstand a lot of punishment. She does have some survivability in her kit. I think that really helps that out. And again, because they were just feeling generous, they gave her the ability to increase her own damage against caster enemies even more. So it is what it is, but clearly they just hate casters at this point. She got 50% charge. That helps her get to her NP quite a bit. And her third skill is a 1-turn evasion. This is actually really solid considering the fact that it's not a times version, because that means that as all the enemies start hitting her, she's going to have that capability to really manage to actually tank the damage. If she had it by number of times, it's possible they could blow through and kill her, and then she wouldn't be able to counter anymore because she's dead. So having the hard single turn survival skill ends up kind of working out for the better for her. And I do think she can be a very, very strong unit. Part of this is because she's going to get attacked by virtually everybody due to her taunt. The way to understand her, and we'll do a full proper servant analysis on her though, is that Fragarak counter can deal a lot of damage. It is enhanced by NP damage, which is a rather unique situation as it appears to just be a normal attack. But it is ultimately her NP. And still, you can definitely see it hit some pretty crazy numbers and one-tap units. The problem that you're going to run into and why you can't just go ahead and use her to sit down and farm all the time is because it won't be consistent. There's quite a few units out there that will just abstain from attacking. That is to say, Bazett will only counter them if they make an action on her or somebody else, basically. So essentially, if the enemy tries to attack Bazett, Bazett will counter. If the enemy tries to buff and it affects Bazett, Bazett will counter. If the enemy tries to debuff Bazett, Bazett will counter. Heck, if the enemy even attempts to heal Bazett in weird circumstances, Bazett will counter. So it is kind of hilarious. But this does mean that the enemy can just buff itself, and as long as it doesn't in any way, shape, or form impact Bazett, Bazett won't counter. So that does mean certain enemies like homunculi or golems that maybe give themselves an attack or a defense buff, they might just do it on 1 turn and then you don't counter them. So if you're trying to use it to farm and trying to use it to 3-turn a node, I've seen this hilariously fail just because of something mundane like that, because you're giving the enemy a turn. And also in that regard, with regards to like speed in terms of actual time, she can be the fastest in terms of actual turns, but in terms of actual time, you're definitely giving all of your enemies a turn to attack, which can, one, make your entire plan go awry, and two, just add time to the run. So just bear that in mind, that it's, you know, kind of an issue. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think Bazett is incredibly strong and incredibly fun to use. I plan on rolling for her. You guys don't necessarily have to. She's not a gotta have, but she is a very fun unit to use. So then with regards to this, keep in mind that this is a Valentine's Day banner. Valentine's banners only have females and gender neutral people in it. They do not have any males, and that's kind of good because basically other units from the banner, let's say you're rolling Tamamo, you might be able to get spooked by Mordred while you're doing so just keep that in mind. You guys can see kind of how they ran it, and I do think that's somewhat of an issue because, yeah, it's gonna be basically separated for each individual even if the duration overlaps, so that means you'll have 3 banners concurrently, but they're only going to be available for the one day. So bear that in mind, that like you're not going to have the capability. Also, each one of these is a separate pity system. It's not going to be like, hey, I can overflow my pity into one of these others. I wish they would change the pity system to allow for that sort of thing, but certainly it is what it is. So let's go ahead and go down the list one by one. I'm not going to talk about any of the units that I've already talked about, but we will certainly talk about any unit that I haven't talked about. Talking about Sitonai here. Sitonai is a single target alter ego. She is arts. Obviously, Casteria existing has really helped her out. She is a unit that I'm going to say doesn't have the strongest kit. Again, she ends up having a weird sort of dragon-specific drain on her NP that can be somewhat useful at times, but it's not the end-all be-all. She ends up having arts up of 3 turns, and she does end up having a 30% charge skill, though, so you do have capability to be able to nuke stuff with her. As far as how Sitonai performs compared to other alter egos, particularly of the single target variety, I'm going to say that she is decent, but that you do get other options, especially from the Evocation Festival, so I'm not sure that she's necessarily a gotta have. She is a story locked unit, oddly enough, so she's not the easiest to get your hands on, but hey, I'm gonna say if you like her, she's not a bad unit given the fact that she is arts, but compared to a unit like Melt, you may just find that Melt just has way more functionality in her kit. And that just depends on you and ends up being a sort of thing where it comes down to taste. You know, I really like Ketz. I really hope they come back and pay some more attention to her, because Ketz deserves better at this point. Last year, she ended up getting a buff that kind of kept her in parity with Ozzy, and then Ozzy ends up getting that extra sort of NP interlude that really just helped him pop off. For years, Ketz and Ozzy were in relative parity until that point, and sadly now, it's not going to be the case really anymore. As a result, this just means that Ketz ends up being a more damage-centric unit compared to Ozzy's more support aspect, but Ozzy ends up as the better damage, so there's not a lot of reason to take Ketz from a gameplay standpoint. I do think they need to come back in and actually revisit this and help her out. Giving her the Star Bomb was definitely a nice thing, and she does have that targetable guts with Buster Up that has always been somewhat useful, but still, it's, you know, neither here nor there. It just adds to kind of her capability, but I think they definitely need to give her some other upgrade to help her out, particularly her NP interlude if they ever want her to kind of stay in parity with Ozzy. Lartoria, you guys know Lartoria is my waifu, so I'm gonna get people that are gonna accuse me of being biased here and say that I can't, you know, not be, but I really love Lartoria. She's an excellent unit that I think honestly goes underappreciated at times. The reason why is when I compare her to a unit like, say, Eresh that she was in competition with for a long time, having basically the charisma on command rather than being a sort of effect on the back end of your NP is really helpful for what comps she can be used in. It just means that you have it right then and there. And so really the only benefit to Eresh would be if you can NP multiple times and stack those attack ups for someone. But then at that point, that relies on Eresh basically taking 2 of the waves herself and letting someone else take the 3rd. So it's a very specific setup for something like that to happen. Still, it is what it is. I've always liked the fact that she has that. She did get the Torrent of Light upgrade here, but the big problem with her, even though she has 2 very widely applicable power mods of 50%, really nice upgrade. The big issue though is she desperately needs that NP interlude. She absolutely has got to get this if she wants to be able to hang with really any of the other AoE Lancers at this point. I can do phenomenal things with my Lartoria because of the amount of charge that she has in her kit. But I've talked about this issue before, that she actually ends up having sort of weird increments and way too much nowadays, since the game is so flooded with charge supports. Back in the day when we didn't have nearly as many of them, she was absolutely stellar, as she was one of the only people that could 3-turn with Merlin as a support. Nowadays, though, that doesn't really matter when Oberon exists in the game. So the fact that she has as much charge as she doesn't really allow her to utilize it in any way, shape, or form that's to her benefit. One of the things I think they could do that would fix her would actually be to give her a rank of overcharge. That would allow her at some point, either on one of her skills or her NP, to be able to hit 30% charge. That would then allow her to function pretty well in, comparison with a unit like Oberon that has an accompanying 20%, or again, some other support that can maybe split charge in different increments. Still, I do think this is the big issue at this point, is for a lot of these units to be able to hold their own with Melisande, it's going to require either the ability to touch Black Grail or another major upgrade, or both. In Artoria's case, they can accomplish this with just 1 NP interlude and have her not necessarily pass Melisande, but at least get a lot more competitive with the ability to touch Black Grail. But it's not going to be a big thing at the end of the day. And I think that's something that the devs need to really take a look at, our AoE Lancers yet again. But still, I do think even though she's not as high damage dealing as some of the other options, still a very good farming unit for a lot of people. Next up, we end up with Queen Medb. Medb has always had a clunky kit. I gotta be honest and say that my biggest issue here is the sort of fact that she charges the NP gauge of male or fey allies. Now, for those of you guys that already went through LV6, y'all know about Nocnaria. I'm not going to spoil anything there, but I'm just going to point out the fact that she doesn't have the Fey trait herself. So, as a result, Medb still only has the 10% charge per turn herself. She doesn't get to take advantage of her 30% charge skill herself. That's unfortunate. I hope at some point they revisit that and allow her to do it, because again, she has had a lot of upgrades and she is not a bad unit by any means, but this largely does sort of limit the amount of comps that she can be used in, and really sort of limits her to just a absolutely male destroying unit there with that super effective niche. Medb's damage has never been in doubt. It's just always kind of been the fluidity of her kit. So is she a bad unit? No, not by any means, but she's always kind of been that clunkiness away from being one of the top tier riders, in my opinion. Still very solid, especially in challenge content. Next we get to Orion, or as I like to call her, Artemis, because again, this is where Orion takes the back seat to his waifu. Orion has been a very much discussed unit over the years in FGO. I think a lot of people would point to Urael and say that Urael is better than Orion. Hilariously enough, Orion is actually, if we're just looking at damage numbers, better than Urael. The issue I think at play, though, comes down to the kit. Urael ends up having a much more fluid kit. As you can see, basically, we have the attack up for 3 turns, which is nice, but the extra modifier of 100% power mod against male enemies is only the single turn duration. And then the third skill is just a 1-turn dodge. We don't have any arts up. We don't have any sort of capability to have charge or anything in her kit. And this is a huge problem, because even though she has a stellar 1% NP gain rate, we also end up basically having a single hit arts card for her 2 arts cards. So she doesn't end up getting a lot of gain off of that. And then even with the NP interlude, they kind of went wrong back in the day by trying to make her a competitor to Squirtoria rather than giving her what she actually needed. In fact, if they were going to try to compare her to Squirtoria, this was sort of the wrong way to do it, as the best way to do it would have instead been to focus on making her have some loopability and refundability, because that's the biggest issue. It's not that your rail's going to deal more damage. In most cases, Orion will deal more. It's the fact that getting Orion back to a second NP is a real pain in the ass. Whereas getting your rail back to a second NP is pretty easy, given the fact that she has decent refund, has charge in her kit, and has a 3-turn art steroid to really help out her NP gain. Orion doesn't have that. So at this point, they really need to start focusing on how they can upgrade Orion's kit to give her either charge per turn, charge, NP gain, or again, arts up. One of those, 4 things would really help Orion out. Again, I'm not going to say Orion's a bad unit. For just pure one-shot damage, she is absolutely fantastic. It just lies in being able to get back to another NP that kind of makes her an issue compared to some of her even 3-star competition. Next up, we have Scheherazade. Shez is, I'm going to say at this point, a much maligned unit on NA. A lot of people read through Agartha and just decided that they didn't like her. Which is sad, because Shez has actually gone through an entire redemption arc where she has talked about her issues that she had. And again, I think you'll see if you actually read through her lines that she's really a very interesting unit. And I bet most of you guys didn't realize that Shez is a Black Grail looping AoE arts caster. Given the fact that she is anti-sovereign in her kit, and you do have some really, really nice stuff in terms of her capability to pop off. So again, she ends up having a 200% super effective modifier, not your standard 150%. So she definitely has some really nice capability. Don't overlook her, but again, she is a permanent unit, so I think a lot of people either already have her or have already written her off at this point. Still, she's definitely capable. Got to be a little bit careful with how you handle the refund, because some of her skills only have the 1-turn duration, particularly her first skill here with the arts up of 1 turn and the charge. To be very cautious about where you use this if you're concerned about damage at low NP levels. All right, next up we end up having Europa here. I think Europa is in a little bit of a weird spot nowadays. It's not that she's a bad unit. In fact, given the fact of how her charge works, she is a buster AoE with 30% charge. I'm not wild about the pairings of a charge skill with her steroids, but let's be honest, you were going to pop the charge skill probably turn 1 anyways, because her optimal setup in order for her to be in a 3-turn is going to end up being basically doing that. So again, you're going to end up having double Koyanskaya and Oberon in order to make her work. So this is where she ends up being in kind of a weird spot. She's not the only 30% charging AoE, rider at this point, especially even Buster, because Ivan is that unit now, and Ivan definitely outdamages her. I think Ivan also has some utility for challenge content that makes him a rival there as well, since he has the ability to buff strip. So at the end of the day, I look towards her and say, well, she could be stronger, but maybe they don't want to make her. The issue at play, though, is that they've also upgraded Drake, who is a 50% charging AoE rider, who's also Buster. And at that point, I think you run into a weird problem where a unit that has more charge also is doing more damage. And that's something I think they need to look into with regards to Europa. That being said, Europa has kind of always been this super defensive unit. I've called her often a more offensive Marie rider, because that is kind of what she has. She has invincibility for 3 attacks, she has the ability to charm all units, and then she has the ability to increase her own defense by 50% for 1 turn on her NP. So as you go through the turns NPing with her in a 3-turn setup, yeah, she's going to take way less damage, potentially have charmed the enemies, and yes, again, even managed to get some really nice steroids, as well as have the invincibility for 3 attacks. Her skill cooldowns aren't bad. Almost all of them can be double popped in a straight 3-turn. Only the 3rd skill can't, and it's kind of understandable why, since it is a charm. That being said, I do think that, you know, still you have other units like Ivan out there, so it's not like she's your de facto Buster AoE challenge rider. So this is where I think they really need to look at Europa and kind of determine her identity. She is a permanent unit. As a result, I think a lot of people didn't roll for her, but I do think she is still a really solid unit. Sadly, she really needs an upgrade at this point in order to be able to hang, in order to be able to stick out, in order to be able to justify kind of where she's at kit-wise. Then we have Dioscuri. Dioscuri is an interesting one because, you know, again, like I said, Valentine's all females, but Dioscuri is gender unknown. So they kind of work here since, you know, at least one of them is a female. Dioscuri is another permanent unit. And so as a result, I think a lot of people didn't get them. But if you've had the luck to be able to use them ever, I think you'll denote just how strong and capable they can be. The damage output leaves a little bit to be desired, but what doesn't is the overall kit, as they have the capability of sort of flip-flopping the performance of their quick and arts cards, as their quick cards will increase their NP gauge by a flat amount of up to 10%, and her arts cards will end up giving stars when used. So this does allow for, again, some really interesting capabilities with being able to charge NP right after an NP, as you can get quite a bit back. Certainly, it depends also on how much you're buffing them and with what units. I do recommend, in my own personal experiences, using arts units like Castoria with them, but certainly I've seen people use Scotty and do some hilarious things, so it just, you know, kind of remains to be seen. You've also got party-wide NP damage, party attack, and then basically the debuff immunity as well. And then a self-evasion for some hard defense tied with the 3-turn steroid. I maybe wish this is, you know, multiple times over multiple turns, since basically it's tied to 3-turn steroids. But at the end of the day, you just got to be careful as to how you need to use that evasion. I do think Dioscuri is really solid, given the fact that they also have the ability to invuln pierce and ignore defense on their NP. You're not going to stop them. They will shred you. And that's kind of the big sort of feather in their cap that I can point to and say, this is why they are good. We are going to have the Trung sisters coming out later this year. I'm going to talk about them, especially in comparison to Dioscuri. But they're a little bit more party focused, a little bit more defensive focused for the party. Dioscuri is a little bit more offensive focused. So there's definitely some interesting comparisons that we can make there. But we'll talk about it again then. Still, I do think Dioscuri is a very good unit. Maybe not the best single target saber, but certainly very nice in a challenge. Then we end up having Jinako. Jinako and I have a rocky relationship at this point, and it has largely to do with her need to spook me many times on JP, which, you know, historically has been a server that I have not spent very much money on. So regardless of my feelings on her, I can talk quite a bit about her kit. I do think Jinako has come a long way with sort of the upgrades that they've given her. The lawful niche really does help in certain circumstances, because there's not a whole lot of people that are anti-lawful. Ironically enough, one of those ends up being Oberon, but hey, it is what it is. Still, I do think having Jinako having some capability to defend herself makes for a very interesting challenge unit. I have been critical of Jinako in the past and said that one of my biggest issues with her is that Jinako is a master of relatively nothing. That is to say, of all the things that Jinako can do, there are other units out there that can do it better. With regards to her being a AoE Moon Cancer, there are better AoE Moon Cancers. With regards to her being a challenge-oriented Moon Cancer, original BB still exists and is very strong in challenges. And with regards to her being a sort of self-survival unit, QSH exists and also can kind of do that same sort of thing a little bit better. Still, I think they saw that, and that is why they kind of came back in here and ended up giving the additional effect, basically, of having the NP damage up and then the lawful alignment. I think they saw that need for her to compete a little bit more in damage to stand out a little bit more, and they did so. And I think it was justified, because her actual damage really did suffer originally without this upgrade. And the issue at play was it was being punished way too much for her defensive capability, when the reality was she couldn't really protect the party and she couldn't really kind of solo as well as other units. So to me, going a little bit deeper into the damage aspect, since she's not foolproof, is a good thing for her. And I do think this does help her. It's still not going to make me go after her myself, but I think she's a much more usable unit now. I think there's a lot more ability to justify taking her into a node compared to how she was prior to that upgrade. So again, if you like Jinako, or again, you're just looking at acquiring her for the future, I do think she pans out a lot better over time, but there are still going to be other moon cancers that you may want to watch out for this year. Next up, we end up with Bradamante. Now, Bradamante has been another one that's come under a decent amount of fire, I'd say, over time. It has to do with her really wonky refund as a quick unit. Some people don't really like her voice, but at the end of the day, I think my issue is just that they really kind of tuned down a lot of quick units post-Scotty. Bradamante, I think, gets often unfairly, I'd say, compared to Britomart. Both of them are AoE, both of them are quick, but essentially at the end of the day, I think both of them are highly usable. Both can basically be able to perform from even a Black Grail type of standpoint, but it definitely requires some finagling. And I'm going to say that Britomart, while a decent option, is probably not going to be most people's target, but that you can make her work, especially into the future where she ends up getting upgrades, particularly to her third skill here that increases the charge to 30% and makes it basically even better with regards to the NP generation rate. She really needed both of these because prior to this point, her refund was very, very low, especially for a quick unit. So she really needed it to kind of help smooth those numbers out and make her more usable. And I do think it really does help. So Bradamante in a much better place. However, again, now she's got competition with Britomart, so it's up to you to determine whether or not you want to roll for her. Again, she is a unit that I'm going to say is kind of polarizing. Next up, we have Vritra, especially as we start talking about our AoE Lancers like we just had there with Bradamante. I think it's important to denote that neither of these options will ever outpace Melisande without significant investment or upgrades from the devs. These things can happen, but I'm going to say Vritra still has the capability of standing out somewhat. Part of this is because she's AoE arts and she does have charge per turn and charge within her kit. So definitely a nice thing. But I'm also going to say the fact that she is anti-divine helps her out even more because there are a ton of divine archers. So this really works for Vritra. I think her refund isn't the best at times for an arts unit, but she's still very usable. I think at NP1 she can definitely struggle, but no more so than most of the other AoE Lancers. So at the end of the day, I'm going to say Vritra is going to come down to taste, and certainly if you like dragon waifus, I think you will like Vritra, as she does have quite a bit of capability, especially due to that arts resist down that she can stack on enemies and the skill seal on the NP. I'm going to say at the end of the day, you don't have to have her, but she's still very quality. Now we get to Tamamo. Now, Tamamo is a, again, hotly contested unit, I'd say, over the years. I've seen a ton of people that basically declared Tamamo dead in a Castoria world. They essentially said that, the devs just wanted to write her off and such. Now, I know there's a ton of people out there that want to say Koyanskaya is not Tamamo, but she is a Tamamo face, regardless of the fact that she's not one of the Tamamo 9. So at the end of the day, if you're going to say that the devs haven't thrown you any bones, they absolutely have, because they have made someone else completely meta. That being said, Tamamo no Mai is not dead. She's absolutely been usable. She's just been relegated to more of a challenge-oriented setup, largely to the same degree that Merlin has. Neither of these units are dead. Neither of these units are bad. They're just kind of pushed into the thing that they do best. And in that regard, Tamamo does not need an upgrade. She's absolutely fantastic at what she does. She is a unit that is pullable with the Origin SSR ticket, and actually, if you don't like Waver, I kind of recommend her to a large degree. She functions very well with Castoria in a complementary sense, because the one thing that Castoria doesn't do is heal. Given the fact that she can also reduce cooldowns on top of this, I think it really does make for a strong challenge setup with the two of them combined. I think the biggest competition for someone like Tamamo no Mae ends up being, later on down the line, Proto Merlin, and we will talk about her into the future, but Proto Merlin is not a perfect unit, and I want you guys to understand that there are some situations where I would value Tamamo more than Proto Merlin, and it really just depends on what situation you find yourself in. But one of those would be the ability to have the NP damage basically from her first skill. The upgrades that Tamamo has gotten over the years have really served her well and allowed her to definitely carve out her own niche to still see use. So again, don't write her off. She's not dead, not by any means. Altera is going to be your next one up here. And Altera is the classic story of the devs basically just didn't want to give Altera what she needed. For years and years and years, we watched as every AoE saber under the sun either got given charge or started with it. Altera didn't have it. They gave her upgrade after upgrade to try and help remedy the fact that she didn't have it. And then they finally realized it was never going to be good enough and they needed to just give her charge. And that's what they did. And when they did that, they made her a monster because it allowed her to function in a double Koyanskaya setup, which then means with all of her upgrades that she can pop her 3 turns of party NP damage in back-to-back turns, her NP gauge as well as critical damage in back-to-back turns, and her attack of 3 turns in back-to-back turns. Means by turn 2, Altera has already reached full strength and can go even harder if you're working with Oberon in the comp. And I think that's the problem that they ran into. They had to give her something, and then they just gave her 30%. And that 30% let her become the monster that she is since it let her work with Double Koyanskaya. She has had her NP interlude. It definitely helped. It was a relatively mundane NP interlude, didn't add any additional effects, but dear God, she didn't need it at this point. So just giving her the charge made all the difference in the world. And I want you guys to remember that and remember how strong Altera is now into the future. Because this is exactly what someone like Iskandar is going to look like if he ever gets charged. Be careful. The units that you write off as bad now, with one upgrade, can just very quickly become meta again. So again, I do think Altera is a very solid unit nowadays. She can outpace most other AoE sabers, and really, it's only the likes of Salter's charge upgrade that she gets later on that allows anyone to really pass her. Then we get to Mordred. And Mordred was a unit that I think for years stayed on top in the early parts of FGO. She's definitely a very solid unit. Most people are going to get Mordred, though, at this point, just simply because this costume is excellent. In fact, in the, as I like to call it, bespectacled testicles event that's going to come out later this year, the Chaldea boys event, she ends up getting a new variant of this costume that puts glasses on her. So it is what it is. This is the epitome of just rolling because you like the unit, not due to anything with regards to their kit. That being said, Mordred's not a bad unit. Like I said, early on in FGO's history, she was actually pretty dominant due to the fact that she was one of the only AoE sabers that had charge. Sadly, her upgrades have not served her as well as some of the other units out there. And the reason for this was just because she really kind of didn't have some of the other intangibles that others had, like Lartoria having charisma and such. I saw a lot of people saying, oh, that's what they need to give her. They need to give her that. They need to give her this. A lot of those people kind of miss the forest for the trees because you guys got to remember that how they design a unit is going to largely be impacted by who the unit is. They wanted to make Mordred be a volatile, sort of rash, treacherous character. And they definitely did that. That's why they gave her Cigarette Lion, which increased her crit damage. And it's why I called it, they upgraded her mana burst to be 3 turns instead of 1 turn. The reason for this is because the solution to giving Mordred more damage was not to give her more damage. It was to give her more turns of damage, let her be used in the Koyanskaya system with a 5-turn cooldown, and then let this be double stacked. That ended up making for a much, much more powerful Mordred. It'll be curious to see how they treat, a unit like Lartoria into the future with this in mind, but I do think Mordred's time in the sun has come. She definitely needed it, and it's kind of wild to see that they ended up buffing Salter to have her passer and Altera as well. But still, I do think Mordred is a very solid 3-turnable unit. You're not going to be able to start her out from 0, but you will be able to put, again, a really nice 50% CE on her and be able to farm hard. Obviously, the damage doesn't have that much of a niche since her NP is more focused on Arthur-traded enemies, but hey, she does have the charge on the back end of her NP, and that really does help her out. She is a unit that can get very close to starting from 0, so just bear that in mind, as units like her can work with things like Mud Rain and such that are a pseudo Black Grail, if you will. Next up, we end up with Sanzang. Sanzang, I think, has reigned supreme as our single target caster for a long time. We've had, units like Ilya that have out-damaged her and such, but the real reason that a lot of people go with and still trust Sanzang is the usability is so strong. She's got 80% charge in her kit. She ends up basically now with a party-wide attack buff as well as a taunt and damage cut. And then the NP generation buff as well as debuff immunity can be super useful at times. So I think this is why a lot of people have flocked to Sanzang. Just the charge alone would have made people want to use her. But again, Titty Monk, as we like to call her, has definitely served us well in situations where we just needed to deal some damage. Now she ignores defense buffs to an enemy as well, and it really, I think, helps out her capability to just shred assassins. Still, at the end of the day, you can definitely make other units outperform her, especially Ilya now that she's gotten some upgrades. But I do think Sanzang will always serve you well as a unit with a ton of charge in her kit. And she is permanent. Next up, we get Anastasia. My girl definitely needs some upgrades. She has gotten some over time, particularly her third skill here has now gained the ability to reduce arts resist for 3 turns. This really did help. I think a lot of people wrote this buff off. It was kind of the same thing as that KARNA buff that we got earlier, where a lot of people looked at this and just went, meh, this isn't that good. It's not going to help that much. The reality is, it really does. This helps out not only her damage performance be more consistent, it also helps out her charge situation because of the arts reduction for 3 turns. Obviously, it's going to be better if you're going up against the same enemy over 3 turns, but what this does allow you to do is it allows you to make choices with regards to the first skill's arts up of 50%, with the third skill's arts resist down of 30%. This means that instead of having to pop the first skill that's 1 turn duration in a prior turn, you can now hold on to that for something like turn 3 and just kind of go. So in a sneaky way, this really does add to her damage capability, as it allows her to not have to use skills earlier than intended. Sadly, this may not be something that gets carried to the boss itself, but you can see they also did end up helping out the cooldown of this skill. I do think at some point they need to look at Anastasia and give her a proper NP interlude, but I don't know that they ever will in, the immediate duration. Something tells me they still have something planned for Anastasia. I don't know what. We'll see into the future. But again, if you already know, please no spoilers. I'm just going to point out the fact that I do think that Anastasia is finally getting better, but they definitely need to keep their eye on her as a unit that I'm going to say had been bad for quite a bit. She had not been unusable, but she had certainly fallen behind several of her other contemporaries, including several 4 stars, which is not a good thing to have. Okay, next up we've got Artoria. So I've talked a lot about AoE sabers now tonight between Altera, Salter, and Mordred at this point. Artoria is not the king in damage anymore. For a long period in time, she was, but we've started to see a veritable arms race with regards to our AoE sabers. Still, she's in a very good spot. If you're someone that is rolling around with already a decently leveled Artoria, rest assured that Artoria will never be a bad unit. She's always just been solid due to low cooldowns and high damage capability. I think the issue at play with her ends up being the fact that at this point, even though Dragon Core is super good, the issue ends up being that everything here is only a 1-turn duration. Due to the fact this is a 5-turn cooldown, you can manage to basically start her from zero with Mud Rain and make this work, but you can also manage to pop these skills back to back. So this means that you can get it basically on turns 2 and 3 and allow yourself damage when you need it. Damage when, the enemy's healths are higher than, say, a dinky first wave. So it is really nice, but it does mean there's no overlap in terms of like being able to carry this effect for multiple turns. We'll see how the devs handle Lartoria into the future. I, for one, obviously I'm a Saberface lover, but I, for one, think the devs do better when they keep sort of their original nostalgic popular units kind of good, right? I'm talking about the Artorias, I'm talking about the Gilgameshes, I'm talking about the Iskandars, you name it. But sort of your original cast from the Fate animes, it's really a good idea to keep them at least competitive, if nothing else. So we'll see, but I do like the game a little bit better when Artoria is popping off. She's still really good. You don't have to worry about her performance in that regard. And I'm going to say, just because other units have managed to, when combining everything, managed to hit harder than her, doesn't make her a bad unit. We're already dealing in like Monopoly money levels of damage at this point, so it is what it is. Still, I would like to see at least a little bit of attention on her in the future, but it doesn't have to be a lot. And I am going to say that the ability to change card types to Buster for one turn is absolutely going to be the biggest selling point for her, given the fact that it means that realistically, even if you didn't have enough damage, cards after the NP will finish off whatever you're trying to kill. We were just talking about Drake earlier with regards to Europa. Again, Drake is a unit that I think has come a long way. Due to the fact that they ended up buffing this second skill, it really helps her. Now, again, she ends up having Ignore Defense on top of her Invuln Pierce. She's a 50% charging Buster AoE Rider. She has Buster performance of 3 turns. Really, really good, because again, due to the fact this is on a 6-turn cooldown, it means we are double stacking this in a Koyan Skya setup. And given the fact that the charge skill is 6 turns, we can easily do that. So there is quite a bit of good synergy in Drake's kit. Only the first skill does not really end up having like multiple turn duration type deal. But given the fact that this one's on a 5-turn cooldown, means just like with Artoria, you could pop the skill on turn 2 and turn 3, the turns that you would actually need it the most. But I think she is in a much, much better spot given all of her upgrades over time. So again, don't write Drake off. She's not going to out-damage someone like Ivan, but she definitely still has really solid damage, and she is a very fun unit to use in that regard. So even though you don't see a lot of people use her nowadays, most of the reason for that is because a lot of the old veterans have overused their Drake and max bonded their Drake. It has nothing to do with the fact that Drake is not a good unit. She absolutely is, and she always has been. Again, highly recommend Drake. Osaka Behime basically ends up being next, and she is... I hate to say it, but Osaka Behime is still just not in a good place. She has gotten a ton of upgrades for too long that have just taken her in what I think is the wrong direction. When Osaka Behime first came out, a lot of people thought she was going to end up being the savior of Quick. They basically looked at her and they said like, oh, she's a Quick support, this is going to be a nice thing. Sadly, they ended up giving her an NP interlude that increased her overcharge effect to give the party's Buster performance of 3 turns. This was not a good buff. It's certainly not bad. Like, obviously every Quick unit has at least 1 Buster card to be used. So there is some value in having this. It's just not at all what Osaka Behime actually needed. I think if they really wanted to help out Osaka Behime, they needed to take a hard look at her and say, how could they make her into more of that sustained support that Quick really does need? They could have looked at her, they could have ended up saying, hey, you know what, let's take this max party HP and bump that up to something like, say, 3,000 base instead. I think that would have helped out quite a bit more. Or maybe even given a heal over time effect a la Merlin. Or I don't know, maybe giving something more than party defense of 20% for 3 turns by, maybe making it a hard survivability type skill like Scotty or Merlin or you name it. So I do think any of those things would have helped her out a lot more. But instead, they push her into this weird sort of like challenge and solo niche. She is a buff stripper. She does have the ability to do some selfish stuff for herself, but that's kind of my issue with her, is she desperately needs to do more for the party rather than just herself. That's what will actually help Osaka Hime see larger use. Otherwise, she ends up, like I said, relegated to this weird challenge niche, or times where you're just up against a weird sort of like writer boss who ends up crushing a lot of your sports. Ironically enough, with the Elmaloy Case Files event, we do end up fighting a particularly nasty writer boss. Osaka Hime can be fairly useful in that fight, but that's one of the only times really that you really kind of need to go with her. Outside of that, there's not a whole lot of other times that she has to be used, and really she doesn't even have to be used there. So it just largely boils down to taste again and desire to use a unit. If you want to use Osaka Hime, she's not unusable, you certainly can. But if you start using Osaka Hime in most of the situations, you had a better option. And I think that's sort of the issue with her. The devs have split what her priorities are, and thus she's not a unit with one ideal in mind. She is basically focusing on two different things at once, and I don't think it serves her very well. On her own, again, as a solo unit, she could be pretty interesting and hilarious to work with, but outside of those scenarios, I think they really still gotta, put her under the sheet and take a look again at this point. Next up, we have Jack. Now, Jack is a unit that I think for years at this point, I've seen people arguing for upgrades for Jack. I don't think Jack's a bad unit. Not by any means. I don't think she ever has been. I think Jack is still one of the best star generators in this game. The issue at play is we don't really need too many star generators nowadays. We have stars abound in so many of our other comps on so many of our other supports. You name it, like Koyan Sky and Oberon, and even for arts, you end up having, basically units like Caster Gil that can give it. So I don't think it's as big of a deal that Jack can generate a ton of stars nowadays. So Jack's real niche is in the ability to remove buffs with her second skill, and then the ability to basically kill females. She's one of the only anti-female units in the game, and that really does work to her advantage, especially now that she has defense ignore. The big thing that I would like to see Jack get more than anything is either charge or some sort of, multi-turn duration for her steroid here. I think this would really help Jack out if she had multiple turns of 50% quick up, because not only would this impact damage output, it would also impact capability to generate stars again. So at the end of the day, I think it is solid for her, and I don't think it's going to break the game if Jack can somehow generate more stars. Especially in a world where most of the time, there's nothing you can do with stars once you're over 50. So I don't think it's that big of a deal, basically, for her to have more capability to do so. I think it would just help her without really breaking her. I think the big thing that a lot of people want to see Jack get is a proper NP interlude. And you might be thinking, well, Cad, there is an NP interlude sitting right here. Here's the thing. Jack started out at 1200%. Jack only went to 1400 when the standard was to go to 1600. And you can see that because if you remember the mantra, whenever you give an NP interlude, usually NP2 becomes the new NP1 and NP5 becomes the new NP2. But you can see they were afraid of Jack, and they basically only gave her 1400 instead of 1600. So in that regard, yeah, give her the Vlad treatment. Finish her original NP interlude by giving her a second one. I think that's appropriate at this point, and I don't think it would break her, especially if you're not going to give her charge. So still, Jack's a really solid unit. Just again, be careful. You're going to have to rely on cards in order to get back to another NP or brute forcing it with charge. She's not going to have charge in her kit. Jandeak. So, Janu is a fantastic unit. That being said, she has not held up well over the years. In the early days of FGO, she was one of the best units at helping keep your party alive, especially pre-Merlin and stuff like that existing in the game. She was a spammable source of hard defense with healing and, again, just added a little bit of extra defense on the back end. That being said, her skills have always sucked. She had Revelation for critical stars per turn. She had the ability to reduce one servant's NP damage per turn. You never want to try and live through an NP if you can prevent it, and John has the ability to prevent it. Here's the thing. Maybe an enemy has buff removal or invuln pierce. Maybe they're just catching you when you don't have John's NP up. That's what this was supposed to do, but it was restricted to servants only, and John doesn't always fight servants. In fact, a lot of your big bosses in certain circumstances will not be servants. So this kind of sucked as far as a limitation went. Even then, even if you landed it, things still might kill you. So at the end of the day, they did come back through and they took a look at this, and I think this is a rather genius upgrade that they gave her. They ended up basically making it so that John had the capability to increase the rate at which a stall run is getting completed. What do I mean by that? I mean, in a challenge scenario where it's going much longer than 3 turns, you're firing off people's NPs, trying to keep the party alive, trying to deal damage to the boss. John was a very slow, plodding comp. It worked in a lot of circumstances, but it took time. Also, she did not really have a lot of consistency with getting to her NP. That is still her issue to this day, and I want to see them adjust that, but we'll talk about that in a second. I think they took a look at Castoria and they realized that Castoria did a lot of the same things that John did. She has a cleanse, she has, a functional invuln on her NP, but it's even stronger than John's. And I think they looked at that and they saw, plus on top of that, she has a ton of party charge and steroids. So people just will take Castoria every time they can get away with it over John, because it's just faster and simpler and safer. And I think they saw that and they said, well, we can at least address the faster part some. And they end up giving her what amounts to a whopping 50% defense down on a target. And I think that's really good, because what that allows you to do is basically speed up that run. That means that using John, now your damage dealer is going to have way more potential damage capability for not only that first turn, but then subsequent 3 turns after. They also ended up changing this to not be restricted to servants anymore, which is really good. And that's exactly what they need to do with this third skill, because dear God, this skill sucks. Even if you level it to 120%, it's not a guarantee to land, and it's still restricted to only servants. This skill absolutely needs an upgrade. It is a travesty that it is still at this point in the game. We are very deep into the life cycle of FGO, and this is the epitome of a year 1 shit skill. Revelation, still very basic as well. I'd like to see them pull an Amakusa and give this like charge per turn. Maybe 10% charge per turn for 5 turns. That would absolutely help John get to an NP. Heck, don't want to make it 5? Make it 3 turns. I think regardless of what you do, it will help, because that is John's biggest issue, is being able to get to that NP when she needs to, having that capability to fire it off and protect the party. And while I'm at it, dear God, this may be one of the only times that I can remember a unit getting an NP interlude that didn't end up buffing anything about the NP level. What do I mean by that? Well, originally John's NP stunned herself for 2 turns. This was a terrible gimmick, and basically people found ways around it in certain circumstances, but it definitely made her clunky to use. So they gave her an NP interlude in their benevolence that not only got rid of that stun effect, but also gave her cleanse. Here's the problem with it. Originally, her NP leveled from 5% defense to 25% defense that she grants the party for 3 turns. To, once she got the NP interlude, it's still the exact same. She got half an NP interlude just like Jack did. This really needs to be addressed. John absolutely is one of my first candidates for, hey, this unit needs a second NP interlude. And the reason why is because these numbers suck. Unless you are rolling around with a high NP level of John, you pretty much don't have respectable numbers here on defense. Yeah, it's 3-turn duration, but I'm gonna be real with you, and I'm just gonna say we have units out there now that have 100% defense for 3 turns. Having a unit give 5% for NP1 is trash. This is not even noticeable. Your units will still die. So, I'm sorry, they absolutely need to come back and do something about this. Again, there is too much of John's kit that is stuck in year 1. I like the upgrade they gave her. She's still a very usable unit, but dear God, yeah, this is like the Nightingale argument all over again. This is a unit that's getting left behind and is a very popular and beloved unit. There is no excuse for this. This is a shame on the devs. They absolutely need to upgrade John's NP and skills. And leaving her in this state just means that many more people will not roll for her when she does actually get a banner. So please, devs, if you're ever listening to any one of my videos, upgrade her. I'm still gonna say if you like her, go for her. She's still a really usable and fun unit when she works right. Just be very careful, and you may want to mix and match who she's working with. Maybe a Merlin, maybe a Proto Merlin down the line, maybe a Castoria, you name it. But I highly, highly recommend, doing something to make sure that John can get to that NP in a timely way when she needs it. Speaking of units with 100% defense, up next, Galatea. So Galatea comes out, and when she came out on JP, a lot of people were immediately like, oh man, Vlad's dead. And then Vlad took that personally and immediately got a upgrade right after Galatea's event that made people immediately flip-flop back the other direction and say, oh shit, Galatea's dead. A lot of people tried to argue Galatea was not dead. I was one of them. And the reason why was mostly different from what other people were saying. I think a lot of people just wanted to defend Galatea, and that's perfectly noble and correct, because none of these units are ever dead. They're not unusable just because another unit comes out or someone else gets an upgrade. That being said, I pointed out one of the issues with Galatea had always been the fact that she was triple buster. Why did that matter? There's a lot of berserkers out there that are triple buster. Well, it kind of matters when you're a single target arts looping berserker. This just means you don't have as many cards to be able to generate NP with. Sure enough, I got proven right on this, even though I had a lot of skeptics originally. Reason why? They ended up coming back and upgrading this third skill to make it so that now when you use her buster cards, you gain 10% charge from it. The devs realized the issue, I realized the issue, but there were a ton of people out there that did not. This really does help Galatea. It really makes her a lot more usable. Still not going to be as fluid as a unit like Vlad, and I do think she'll eventually get another upgrade to really help this out, but she is not a bad unit by any means. Like we were talking about, this second skill right here is a 2 times 3 turns 100% defense increase. This is really good for a squishy berserker. You're not going to be able to deal a lot of damage against something like that, and it's going to take quite a bit of buffs from an enemy to be able to actually, lay down the law on Galatea with this skill active. So it's really, really nice for a squishy berserker like her. Again, she does have the guts as well to really help her out, and you guys can see she does have the ability to drain with her NP, as opposed to Vlad's vampirism being from a skill and being a one-off drain. Galatea could loop potentially and keep draining, so it is really nice if you can manage to secure the loop. So I do think Galatea is still quite usable and still quite good, regardless of Vlad's current state. And we already talked about Nightingale, so we don't have to talk about her. I would be remiss, though, if I moved on and did not talk about Valentine's Witches. I've actually talked about them in quite a few of the analyses already this year. Valentine's Witches are a very good MLB CE, all attack scaling. Basically, ignore invincibility, NP damage up of 25%, which can be doubled up with a unit like Oberon, and NP generation rate of 10%. So it's an all-around really solid invincible pure CE that should work in every situation that you would want it to. Other than it's maybe not the best to use on a buster unit in a 3-turn, but hey, I digress. The whole point is, this is still a solid option, especially if you can't get your hands on a CE like Honey Lake. So yeah, I do think this could be a really, really useful thing for those of you guys that are going to be rolling Bazett or any one of the other Valentine's banners that are here. Still, let's go ahead and talk about the rest of, finally, February. We do end up getting a rerun campaign here. Again, just kind of denoting this is where we get the return of Karen. So we just got the NP interlude for her. She comes back. Karen is a very good unit. I had a question the other day on stream as to what quick AoE units could Black Grail loop. Karen is absolutely one of them, and it's actually to her benefit to do so, as using things like Black Grail or putting an Avenger on her back line allows her to trigger her unique passive that basically increases her amount of damage while she has debuffs. So even putting an Avenger in the back line will count for this, and it's really, really nice as it's just 20% extra attack out of nowhere. So again, Karen has often been a unit that I think people either liked her or didn't like her. They just, she was kind of polarizing in that sense. Still, that being said, she's never been a bad unit. Even before that NP interlude, she was solid, so I was surprised that they kind of revisited this and decided to give her one. Definitely helped out her damage quite a bit, as it not only increased it, but also added the basically super effective niche against chaotic enemies. This really gave her a way to stand out from the likes of competition with, say, like Amakusa and other AoE rulers. So I do think this really is awesome for her, and she is still to date one of our hardest hitting AoE rulers in that regard. So definitely don't overlook her, even if you may be looking forward at some of the stuff to come. Next up, we end up having the Seraph basically commemorative summoning campaign. It's because of free access. So again, this is another main interlude that they are bringing back for free. So this means that if you've already purchased the CCC main interlude, that you will now get the rare prisms refunded, and it will no longer cost as long as you guys have completed the requirement in order to do so. Still, we have some really good options here for units. And just to real quick pull you into the pre-campaign here, you can also see this is going to be one of the chances that you guys get for a 2-time super success. Again, I wanted to denote this as this is one of those things where NA just kind of got shafted on getting it for New Year's, so a lot of you guys are going to be paying attention. I think there may even be one for Valentine's for certain units as well. So just keep that in mind, that there will be quite a bit of units here that will be available for 2-time success rate. It won't be every unit, but it will be quite a bit. So it is what it is. Just keep in mind that you're probably not going to see another 2-time suck rate until something like the 25 million downloads campaign rolls along. You will see very selected targeted ones though in the interim. And again, you're going to have Ember Gathering and such at half cost, as well as a lot of stuff returning. As long as you guys will have completed Solomon, that'll fulfill the requirement for Seraph. So now, talking about the actual banner. First up here, we end up with Melt. Melt has, as I've talked about single target alter egos already, always been a solid option. Originally, she was kind of clunky with the way her third skill worked. This had always just been somewhat of an issue, as she had the ability to reduce all enemies' NP damage for 1 turn, and then reduce the party's NP damage except for herself for 1 turn, and then had a delayed buff that activated the next turn that increased NP damage by 20%. So this was just kind of weird and wonky with trying to time the reduction to an enemy's NP, with trying to time the pop off for your NP, with maybe one of your other allies wanted to NP the turn before Melt did, and it just didn't work well. So this kind of ends up getting the buff that allows her to increase her own NP damage for 2 turns instead of that stupid delay effect. Nobody liked the delay effect, and I think the devs just came up with an eloquent solution. In fact, I've talked about Artoria Bunny, basically her ruler form. This is exactly one of the buffs I want to see for her in that regard. So this would be fantastic if they kind of gave certain other units this same sort of treatment, because sometimes the 1-turn delay just ends up being clunky and unfun, and I think they solved that with Melt. Still, they've ended up coming back and giving her Sadistic Constitution a buff that basically allows her to continuously proc crit damage up of 15% for 3 turns. And it's kind of wild how there is no limitation to this in a game that seemingly fears card lock and, you know, puts a limitation of a number of times on a bunch of skills. They allowed this skill to be totally uncapped, so you can get quite a bit of crit damage up on Melt, especially in a solo environment. Definitely a really, really solid buff for her. And then she still ends up having Crime Ballet's upgrade that gave her 30% charge. So Melt is in a much better state on JP. She is a quick unit, but she's always been strong because of her capability to remove an enemy's buffs. Just keep in mind, this is maybe the downside to Melt now. Since they fixed every other aspect of her kit, the fact that she removes buffs after damage is her weakness. It's both a good thing to have, but also annoying if an enemy is actually dodging or invulning or something like that. You're not going to be able to remove the buffs before your damage goes out. So that is kind of the downside. Still, highly recommend rolling for Melt. King Protea is definitely a more clunky unit, I'd say, nowadays. She's very fun in challenge environments due to her ability to scale HP. She has gotten an upgrade that gave her the, again, all too familiar NP damage resist that you guys maybe see, the special damage resist that you see in certain fights. Really good, and this does actually allow her to stack this and be very, very tanky. It's very hard to kill a King Protea that's properly supported. It's much more likely that your supports will die long before the King Protea does. Still, that being said, NP damage is NP damage, and it's definitely possible that, you know, units still carve right through her if she doesn't have the proper support. She does have the ability to charge her NP. This does mean that you can actually 3-turn with a King Protea, but it's not the most, you know, good 3-turn. It's like I said, pretty clunky in that regard. And then she has the ability to increase her own NP damage per HP growth buff stack for 3 turns, just meaning that the more turns go by, the more power this gets. And it's really, really strong for her. She has really good passive skills as well, and then just ends up basically having the ability to increase buster performance as long as she has the HP growth stack. So the only thing you gotta watch out for is needing to sacrifice the growth stacks to gain charge. If you do that, certainly this will allow you to 3-turn, but certainly this will impact damage performance, so it's just something you've got to be cognizant of. But yes, I am going to say the majority of usefulness for someone like King Protea is going to be in that challenge environment where things are going much longer than 3 turns, because that's going to allow her to really, really, really stack her health and really allow her to just take quite a bit of a beating. Passion Lip is a very interesting unit in comparison. She is also AoE buster. I think the hilarious part to watch with Passion Lip is Passion Lip was the epitome of a unit that had a lot of utility and had a damage dealing NP that also had healing on it. So for a long time, I thought that they would want to keep the damage down on that because it does so much. And it's still not crazy levels of damage, but they did give it upgrades, which is kind of wild. And I'm really surprised that they did. Passion Lip is a really fun challenge unit. You won't see me using her outside of that, though, sadly. She does have the ability to charge her own NP gauge by 20% now, which does technically allow her to be able to 3-turn, but still, I don't think it's one that I would necessarily go for all the time. You just have to be cognizant of the fact that she basically can increase her own defense for 1 turn, but then with regards to her 3rd skill, she can stun herself. So you want to make sure that you're doing this once you've activated her 1st skill first for the debuff immunity. Being able to stun yourself, not going to go well if you don't watch out for that. Still, that being said, the ability to taunt and draw all enemies to her allows her to really kind of be this sort of pseudo tank slash healing slash damage dealing unit. And given the fact that her 3rd skill has the ability to instant kill when a normal attacking, it's kind of funny to watch when this actually does land on a boss or, again, a really like high health enemy. Still, I'm gonna say she's absolutely not meta, but she is a very interesting and fun unit for you guys that maybe haven't managed to get your hands on her. And then we have Suzuka Saber. Suzuka has also been another unit that's gotten quite a bit of buffs over the years. She's ended up getting definitely some nice upgrades to her buster performance, allowing it to be multi-turn duration. And then certainly they haven't paid any attention to the rest of her skills, but realistically she already had a good kit with the NP damage and NP gauge per turn. I always found it weird that they gave her 5 turns instead of like 3 turns, but I suppose it's better than having nothing, and it definitely is something that does allow her to be able to 3-turn with a double Oberon type of setup. So again, the fact that they've come back through and given her any love at all has really helped. She does have her NP, and it does increase NP generation rate. To me, this is a rather odd choice, but again, I don't really like NP gen on Buster units, but it still can be useful if you do have to card. And I think that's where they've always viewed Suzuka, was in a little bit more of a like unconventional environment where you maybe did go beyond the 3-turn duration. I think you see that kind of design choice with a lot of the CCC units, where they're meant more to last rather than to be your meta 3-turn farmer. Doesn't make them bad units, they're still definitely usable, and they're still really fun to use, and I do really like Suzuka. And that's gonna be it basically then at that point for February. Okay, now we're in March, and so we're gonna be starting the Bespectacled Testicles event, as I like to call it. Basically, this is gonna be your white day. It's Bespectacled Intellectuals. Essentially, this one is going to be the male counterpart to Valentine's Day. So if you guys have never seen a White Day banner before, please understand that the summoning campaign will include only males and gender neutral people. It's going to be another huge like laundry list of people that I have to go through compared to Valentine's Day, but it is what it is, and we're going to talk about it. There is also going to be an accompanying Merlin campaign. We'll talk about that. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. Obviously, Arjuna Alter is going to be, you know, very celebrated. This is his first return in many moons, as we have not seen him back on NA for, you know, well over a year at this point. I get a lot of questions nowadays about Arjuna Alter and his performance down the stretch, like how he's still panning out on JP. And I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to say I have an NP1 Arjuna Alter on my JP account. I don't use him very often. It's just not that big of a deal. He's certainly usable, and I do think he's still good. And I think this is kind of the issue that we have, is we get a lot of people discussing, are these units still good in current year? And the answer is yes, they're still good. How they hold up and how well they pan out with the like highest ends of content is always suspect. I think the big thing to understand, guys, is as you start looking towards 90++ content, that it really becomes about damage bonus in an event or having enough NP levels. It doesn't matter the unit, it matters the firepower of the unit. This is why I have chosen to not hype 90++ content too much to you guys, because I don't think it would make me a good content creator if I went out there and told all of y'all to spend more money on the game. I think instead I should be trying to find ways to save you money. And so as a result, pointing out the fact that 90++ is really not that much more efficient for most people kind of belies that point, that you really shouldn't have to roll more just to be able to do content. I think FGO for years has been a game that has allowed people to be able to operate with NP1s for the vast majority of content. And the higher NP levels were either for collection's sake and showboating, or for the ability to do things at an increased efficiency. So we can argue that that's all 90++ is just the attempt at increased efficiency, and it's not always there. So you don't have to do it, you don't have to stress too much about it. There will be nodes that you'll want to do at least the singular time, but again, don't feel like just because your NP1 is not cutting it, that you're somehow like failing the game or something like that. So taking a look at Arjuna Alter then with that in mind, and I'm going to point out the fact that yes, we obviously have units like Morgan Le Fay that have come out that are very usable. We have units coming up like Summer Ibuki that are very strong. Does that mean Arjuna Alter is bad now? No, his damage is still extremely high. He is still capable of 3-turning. He's just not a Black Grail 3-turner. He's somebody that can 3-turn from a 50% starting charge CE and do a lot of damage. And for that reason alone, Arjuna Alter will always be good. So if you like him, if you prefer him over someone like Morgan or Ibuki, rest assured that he will still work very well for you. He's not going to be able to start from 0, but, well, there's plenty of situations where other units can't do it either. So he's not alone in that regard. And he's still very competitive with his other contemporaries in terms of that damage standpoint. So he's absolutely usable. He's just not as usable, I'd say, as some of the other options. And that really just comes down to comp preference and sort of malleability of some of the other units like Morgan and their ability to adapt to various situations. Still, Arjuna Alter, absolutely fantastic in current year on JP. If you like him, absolutely, I recommend rolling. We also have him paired with Saito Hajime. Now, you're going to hear coming up on NA as one of the 90++ nodes that's going to be coming out this year has a node that can be done with Saito Hajime. It actually ends up being our first real 90++ node in the summer event that ends up having a 1 million damage in Kidu. It's a 1/1/1 node, and Saito Hajime can loop it. Do you have to roll Saito Hajime to do that? No. There are plenty of other single target sabers that can get the job done. And again, you don't have to farm that particular node if you don't want. You can step down to the 90 or the 90+ as you will. So that was the reason that I was making that point, is to let you guys know that there are other options and you don't have to feel like you need it. And again, in Hajime's case, yes, he's good, but he is absolutely not a gotta use. If you did roll here, you'll have a pretty robust one probably, and that will help you out. But certainly there are other units like even welfares like Hoku Saber that can work for you in that node, so don't fret it too much. You should be fine. Saito Hajime himself is actually a pretty interesting unit. He's Buster and Arts synergistic. He's definitely got quite the ability to gain NP off the back of his NP, and that is why a lot of people were using him, was his stellar NP gain rate, especially considering the fact that his NP is 7 hits. That's always been good for him, and then the fact that even if he did low roll, he managed to stack Arts Resist down was definitely a good thing for him. But yes, again, he's just an all-around solid unit. There's really actually not that much that stand out-ish about him. So don't feel bad if you don't want him. Don't feel bad if you want to use someone else. Again, he's just a solid unit. Moving on to our actual banners here, you guys can see it's going to be the same sort of deal. Arjuna Alter will always be on rate up, but you will have rotations of several of the other units on a one-day sort of time scale. So we're going to talk about our first one here, which is Ku Alter. Ku Alter is another one I get a lot of questions about over the years. He does not have charge in his kit. That's always been sort of an issue holding him back. But I'm going to say if you're looking for Ku Alter to get charged, you're missing the forest for the trees, because Ku Alter is just designed to be a little bit more of a like offensive Herc. It's kind of hilarious given the buffs to Herc over the years, as we can argue that Herc is more offensive than Ku Alter nowadays. But I do think there's an argument to be had there, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that Ku Alter finally did get his NP interlude. And this does help out, as he has the ability to remove enemy buffs that are defensive. So you're not stopping him, you can only hope to contain him. And as a result, he still ends up having his attack and defense up on his overcharge. He ends up just having a ton of extra firepower due to the amount added from the NP interlude, as well as the ability that he's unable to be stopped. So it makes him a very effective boss killer, especially given the fact that you can kind of just have him operate into a solo with his 2 attack evasion on a 5-turn cooldown. He definitely ends up being quite the same cockroach as Ku, maybe not as effective as OG Ku in that regard, but still certainly very solid and very good. I think you could sit there and say that Herc is a little bit more survivable than Ku is, but certainly at the end of the day, Ku is still a very good unit. So don't write him off. He's still really solid, and his damage is absolutely spectacular if you support him well, or if you manage to solo with him and end up chaining Brave Chains all the time. So again, I'm going to say he's definitely an option for those of you guys that don't have Herc, and even still, you may find uses due to that buff removal that he has. Nemo is definitely an interesting unit. We just got the AoE Rider welfare version of Nemo for Santa, basically, this year on JP for Christmas. I'm going to say this. Nemo, I think, has always been this sort of like weird unit for people, as he is permanent. There are a ton of people that do like him due to his involvement in the story, But the fact that he doesn't have triple arts in his deck, the fact that he has weird conditionals on his gut skill, I think has largely made people go like, he's okay, but I don't know how I feel about him. Truth be told, his performance is middling if nothing's going your way, if you don't have him in niche, if you don't have his guts proc, but you can manage to really get some crazy numbers out of him if you actually can get his niches to align. And still, Waterside is a very common field, so you're going to see this basically every single summer event, and as a result of that, I do think that you can manage to find uses for Nemo, regardless of, sort of who else you have. And in that regard, I'm going to say this, the fact that he's permanent definitely helps him out. You definitely do not have to roll for him, but he is arts, and so if you like using single target arts, he's definitely a good option for you, given all the additional effects that he has. Plus, again, super large killer, that does make him a decent option for that if you don't have someone like Fujino to really help you out in a single target capacity. But still, there is also David out there that can help out with giant enemies, so it just remains to be seen as to whether or not you do need it. Next up, we have Enkidu. Again, Enkidu is gender unknown, but you didn't see Enkidu really on the female banner. I think it's just because they had too many units and they decided to balance it out. So Enkidu ends up in an interesting spot nowadays. I criticized the original buff to Enkidu, and I still feel justified in that. Because while Enkidu is someone that should be strong in the lore, I think you definitely see over time this weird sort of evolution of a monster coming out, where Enkidu had, for a long period in time, been like third on the damage list for people in terms of his actual capability. He wasn't bad. He definitely dealt solid damage. You really, for a long period in time, only had like the likes of Brynhildr and Shisho out damaging him. And then somehow they thought that, arguably the best tanky Lancer, and I say arguably because Ku exists, but at least of the 5 stars, the most tanky Lancer by far, they thought that it was a good idea to take that and make it the highest damage dealing unit. And I think that was a mistake. I've always pointed out that I felt like that buff was too strong. They went way too hard with the amount of effects that they gave the NP, and that kind of becomes apparent when you start to look at it, as it's not only damage to one enemy and the ability to stun Divine with 20% defense down for 3 turns that activates first, to hey, now we get a damage increase, now we get a whole new super effective 200% niche, and we increase the overcharge effect by an additional 10% on top of that. This, to me, more than anything, right here, the overcharge effect increase is where they went wrong. That's where they just made Enkidu's damage stupid. They could have left that at 20% and given him the NP interlude, and Enkidu would have been fine. Nobody was not using Enkidu. So it was really kind of weird to me to see this kind of happen, as it just sort of made the tankiest character that should have dealt the least damage now to the character dealing the most damage for single target Lancers. Then, as if he needed something more, they decided to come back, after his initial buff and start giving the other single target Lancers charge. They basically said, okay, look, we've made Enkidu strong, you guys still have your niches, but you also are now going to have charge that you stand out from Enkidu and have a little bit more usability in the face of him. And then they destroyed all of that with the most recent buff, where they gave Enkidu 50% charge where he had none. I don't understand the devs. It at times just feels like they don't want to balance their game, and they don't want units to be desirable. Like, it's not the fact that they're buffing Enkidu. It's the fact of how much they're buffing Enkidu. It's how strong they're making Enkidu in comparison to his competition. That's the issue I have with it. So Enkidu is a very good unit. If you want to roll for him, I highly recommend it. He's fantastic in soloing and challenge environments. And yeah, now he can be a 3-turning single target Lancer if you need it. It's not going to be as fluid as something like Double Koyanskaya, but it does work. And it's kind of hilarious that they gave him this capability, given how strong he already is. So again, highly recommend it. Very tanky, very survivable, and still good damage to top it off. We already talked about KARNA, so I'm not going to waste any more time on him. Next up is Odysseus. And hilariously enough, we're going to have the Tesla Fest banner coming up that includes both Odysseus and Tesla, which is freaking hilarious because they're on the same day here. It's almost like someone did White Day and thought, like, we can make an event out of this banner. Which I don't think they did, but like I assume they already had the plans and the works ahead of that. But it definitely feels kind of hilarious to me to see that in retrospect. Odysseus is a good unit. I think at this point, though, we have way too many good arts AoE writers. You know, we started out with Surfmo. We went years and years and years without really anything. And then we get Da Vinci Writer, who's just phenomenal for the party. Then we get Odysseus. And then we end up with Habitrot, and now we have Nemo Santa on top of all of that. So it's like, it's kind of wild. Odysseus is a very loopable AoE writer. I think, you know, maybe not as loopable as someone like Da Vinci Writer, but I think the big takeaway for Odysseus and what he can do that the others can't is the fact that he can remove all enemies' defensive buffs activating first before dealing damage. This means that if your annoying caster enemy is spamming invuln or, you know, again, solemn defense, you don't care. You're removing it and you're killing them. This is where Odysseus is very strong. He's still got a little bit of a damage edge over the likes of, you know, someone like Da Vinci Writer, but I think the problem is then you like roll around with like Habitrot Black Grail looping, and you know, with her being a welfare, it really hurts the usefulness of a unit like Odysseus. So I wouldn't be surprised down the stretch to see a unit like Odysseus end up getting an NP interlude or some sort of buff to his skills, but he's still very good. That being said, there's going to be another AoE arts writer this year that we'll be talking about later in the banner review. So again, solid unit, but up to you to determine whether or not you need it. Next up, we have Tesla, and Tesla is a unit that I think has been very maligned for years. I don't think a lot of people liked him either because they didn't like his design or they just felt like his, you know, conditionals were too much. That is to say, like, his skills just were not very consistent. Well, you can see the devs thought wrongly about this and said, hey, we don't like the fact that you don't like Tesla. We are buffing the crap out of him. So they buffed him, and they buffed him, and you can see he now gives party buff success rate for 3 turns of 20%, which helps out with his natural born genius being an 80% chance to proc. Then to top it off, they also made it 3 turns and added an additional attack effect, and he still already had charge and invincibility because he shares the same exact skill as Drake. So Tesla has come a long way and is a much more consistent and usable unit than he ever used to be. Tesla has always had good niches with his NP, and it has had its NP interlude. Has a 40% chance to stun. Please don't rely on this. But it does have the ability to deal extra damage to servant enemies that have earth or sky attributes. Well, that's basically 2 of the 5 attributes, and it's 2 of the major 3 attributes, because Beast and Star do not show up very often. So earth and sky means he's effective against everything other than man-servant enemies, and it's super effective. Tesla's pretty bonkers nowadays. Just is what it is. Always kind of had that potential, but the big thing holding him back was the lack of consistency due to his 80% procs, and basically the fact that his skills were just pretty lackluster in the beginning. So the 50% charge, though, always allowed him to be strong, and this is where I'm going to say him being a story lock means not a lot of people end up having him. This is a decent opportunity to manage to roll him because he doesn't get a lot of solo rate ups. And I think this is something to point out that with regards to Valentine's Day and White Day, these are some of the only times you're going to get these permanent and story locked units on a solo banner to be able to roll them. Otherwise, a lot of the times you just don't see them, but like, you know, weirdly mixed in. Or again, just not getting a banner at all because they're considered to be common, I guess, at this point. So I do think this is a very good set of buffs for Tesla, and I do think you guys should pay attention to that. So Xiang Yu is another unit, I think, at this point that's come a long way. He definitely, when he was first released, was not in a good place, and the reason for this is because I think a lot of people were expecting him to be sort of a 5-star Lancelot Berserker. At the time, Quick was still pretty strong, and I think a lot of people were hoping that he would be too. But naturally, the devs kind of messed up when they made Lancelot Berserker, as loopable as he was and as strong as he was, and they didn't want to have that happen again. So they made Xiang Yu pretty tame. They didn't really give him any charge in his kit, and they've now come back since and tried to buff him and turn him into a little bit more of a crit unit, giving him 100% crit damage there on his first skill, while he still already had 50% on the second skill. Again, he does have a Invuln Pierce, but this is something that shortly thereafter got immediately kind of challenged by a unit called Musashi Berserker. The Musashi Berserker was a 3-turn loopable arts unit, and while she herself didn't really come into her own until Castoria came out, you could 3-turn with her prior to Castoria, and so that did make Xiang Yu's situation a lot more precarious from a farming standpoint. So he was relegated mostly to that like crit type of standpoint, and it really just didn't do a whole lot for him. Nowadays, though, ironically enough, you can manage to 3-turn with Xiang Yu, but it usually requires a double Oberon setup because it's the only way to brute force enough charge into him in order to make it work. Again, I do think he has a nice kit at this point, particularly with regards to how much crit power he can really pump out. But yeah, I do think he is sort of a niche unit at this point and not something that most people are going to go for. So I can't really recommend it unless you're just trying to get him for collection's sake. But that being said, he is permanent, so you don't really have to have him. Then we end up with Old Man Stan Lee, as I like to call him, aka Li Shuan. Old Lee here is basically the older counterpart to his Lancer form. He is essentially our one-punch man, and, you know, honestly, Li Shuan doesn't really get a whole lot of attention or a whole lot of love, but he's actually quite the good unit. He, for a period in time, was the highest damage single-target assassin in the game. He did kind of get surpassed somewhat by King Hassan in weird niches, and NA kind of jumped the gun and got one of those upgrades a little bit early, so Li Shuan hasn't not gotten nearly the attention on NA. That being said, he's still a good unit. I think the thing holding him back again is going to be that lack of charge, but he's not really meant to be that. He's meant to be sort of this nukeable, you know, critable, like, just, you know, one-stop shop and blow you up. His biggest issue, I think, is the fact that a lot of his skill durations are just one turn, so it's kind of a very much just press all the buttons in one turn and go, blow your load, and then wait the, you know, cooldown durations to get back to it if you can't manage to finish the enemy off in subsequent turns. That being said, he does have debuff immunity, he does end up having quite ability to crit and soak the stars to himself, and he does have hard survival, so he's not the worst at that point. His NP does have the ability to instant damage them, and it did get an NP interlude already, which is one of the reasons why his damage is actually fairly good. Also, given the fact that he is arts, means there's numerous other supports that you can pair with him in order to make him successful, so I do think he is a fairly solid unit, but again, it's up to you to determine whether or not you need him, and he's still probably not my go-to single-target assassin of choice, given some of the other options that are out there, like Kama. But it is what it is, and I'm going to say that Li Shuan can be a very good single-target assassin for you if you have no one else. Next up, we have Taigong Wang. This will be his return. He will have already come back with a permanent banner despite his release there during Tunguska. So this will be a good time to snag him if you basically had, you know, abstained from rolling Tunguska for whatever reason, but you still kind of wanted him. Again, you will have the Valentine CEs. We'll talk about them here in a second, but let's talk about Taigong Wang. I talked about him in his servant review recently and said that a lot of people really undersell him. They look at his kit, they just see that it's quick, and they kind of write him off, and they don't realize how good it can be. Part of the reason that it's so good is because this original skill right here, his first skill, ends up having 3 different things that can really buff the party. Even if you take quick out, just having the 15% attack up and 15% NP damage up is 30% worth of steroids that you're giving everybody in the party for 3 turns. That's still solid support right there. His second skill gives him divinity and demonic power mods, which are really good, especially considering he also has anti-divine super effective modifier on his NP. And then his third skill ends up charging himself 30% only, but then charging everybody in the party 20%, making him work really good in conjunction with units like Koyami or anyone else that has party charge to help round numbers up to greater increments. Or again, he can work with other units that just have their own set of charge and maybe a starting CE to really just help finish them off and get them to full. So again, I do think he's a really versatile and rather lucrative unit in that sense. You'll often find that you don't have to use him, but there are times that he works very well, and there are definitely times that I have wished that I either had him or had a more robust version of him on JP from when I both didn't and did finally get him after getting spooked by him at some point. But again, like I said, he is a very solid unit, and this will be your first opportunity to actually pick him up again. Next up, we've got Vlad III. We were talking about Galatea earlier and how, there was this whole argument with basically, oh, Galatea's come out, Vlad is dead. Oh, Vlad got a buff, now Galatea is dead. Rest assured, at some point, Galatea is going to get a buff, but that's not going to make Vlad dead. Vlad just has a very good kit. He's come a long way from where he was. He's one of our original release units, and basically he's gotten the short end of the stick for a long time, which is why the community perception on Vlad generally is negative. But he is absolutely fantastic as of this point on NA, and you don't need to worry about him in that regard. He's somebody that as a berserker can 3-turn single target loop. He's got a ton of refund, and now his whole situation with his half interlude has basically been remedied. We talked about this earlier with Jack, that, basically they gave her a half interlude and they didn't, give her the complete amount. Vlad started out gimped. They gave him basically a half interlude, and then they remedied it finally to get him to an actual full NP interluded number, and that really did help him out. You can see he's had a ton of upgrades basically to just about every single aspect of his kit. He is a vampire, so he can drain. He does have basically defense and attack up, and he also has guts that is stackable at this point that really just helps out with his survivability. Vlad used to be used in sort of these omni stall comps that allowed you to be able to attack anything. The problem was keeping Vlad alive in those comps, and it's why you often had to pair him with Tamamo and Waver back in the day. But nowadays, it's much easier to support and keep Vlad alive with Castoria, so really there's no real concern about him over the stretch of a fight. It's just really going to come down to cooldown usage more than anything. But still, Vlad is fantastic and absolutely a great single target nuker, and since he is Berserker, he's going to be effective against just about everyone. Next up, we end up having Ozzy. We talked about Ozzy in relation to Quetzalcoatl earlier. Ozzy was the beneficiary of them butting heads, where they both got an upgrade at first, and then Ozzy pulled away when Ozzy finally gets an NP interlude. Again, Ketz and Ozzy had been in relative parity for years at that point on FGO, and now they finally have come back and just said, hey, you know what? The Sun God basically should be a lot stronger. And so they end up buffing his first skill to allow him to enhance the party's critical damage and critical stars when on Sunlight Battlefield for 3 turns. And then they ended up allowing him to bring the sun to the battlefield with his NP interlude, basically giving him Sunlight Battlefield for not just 1 turn, not 3 turns, but 5 turns, which is really, really solid in that regard. He also has the ability to reduce his own skill cooldowns by 1. This isn't super useful, but it's also not bad, especially if you manage to be NPing with him at the right time. This may just allow you to get back to your skills 1 turn faster, and that's really all you can ask for from this. So again, at the end of the day, it's just a nice extra thing to have, but don't expect too much usefulness when pairing with like Koyanskaya and for stuff like that, because it is a little bit wonky as to how it actually plays out with cooldowns. Still, Ozzy's a fantastic unit. He's always been strong, and he's now even stronger. He's probably one of your hardest hitting single target riders at this point, and he still has quite a bit of support capability with his 20% charge skill and his ability to buff success chance on basically anyone else in your party. So that's really, really nice for him to have it. It also allows him to make his Imperial Privilege foolproof in that regard, so you can always count on him having the effects of that skill. So he has consistency despite the fact that he is basically an emperor at this point. Next up, we end up with Napoleon. Napoleon is, I think, an interesting unit. He's certainly not your strongest archer, but he has been in the competition, and the big reason for that actually deals with his NP. Again, he has already had his NP interlude that now ignores defense, but you can see that it deals super effective damage against divine enemies. Again, the only issue with this is the fact that Napoleon is an archer, and there's not too many divine sabers. That being said, this can work on neutral classes, this can work on berserkers, and yeah, we have started to see some divine sabers come into the game now, including most recently on JP, Yamato Takeru is another one. So yes, that niche is getting better over time, and Napoleon, if he's actually in niche, has rivaled Gil for a long time. Granted, Gil is now beginning to pull ahead due to his recent buffs, but still, at the end of the day, I have to give Napoleon respect for what he is. He is a very solid 3-turnable farmer that is anti-divine, and that's going to have its uses regardless. So, again, I do think he could be a really solid unit for you. You can put him in a double Koyanskaya comp and have it work, and the reason for this is because his NP charge skill of 30% is on this 6-turn cooldown, so it does allow him to be paired with double Koyanskaya Oberon and get some really nice firepower out of it. Next up, we end up with Achilles. Achilles is a weird unit for me, and the reason that I say this is because he is a unit that has, for a long period in time, I think, had quite a bit of capability. He's excellent in like min turns and challenge quests. The problem with Achilles is his refund is rather weird. He is a quick unit, so you already knew it wasn't going to be the most robust thing in the world, but a lot of it has to do with the way his third skill works. The fact that he ends up with 30% NP gain and 30% charge adds for some weird times where you want to use his charge skill, but it's not the good turn that you needed the NP gain on, or vice versa. And it just ends up being kind of clunky with him since his base refund is such a low number compared to, like, say, Arts Loopers or even some of his other contemporaries and quick units. So I do think he's still a very good and absolutely 3-turnable unit. You just have to be very careful with his charge situation and his refund situation and make sure that you actually have enough to secure his ability to do so that he doesn't lowball you at certain times. But definitely, if you can plan him accordingly, I think he's absolutely solid. He does have 3 turns of quick up, and again, a multi-attack invincibility. So, and the fact that it lasts for 5 turns on top of that ends up just being more icing on the cake. So again, he's really solid, really survivable, pretty good even when he's not being properly supported, but it's up to you to determine whether or not you want to roll on him. Remember, he is permanent. Next up, we end up with Waver. We did talk a little bit about Waver earlier, I believe. But again, the key principle on Waver is that this will be a solo banner for him. You can potentially roll him here if you didn't take him with the ticket. And this will allow you guys to basically be able to pick up another 50% charger. Remember, Waver's whole shtick compared to someone like Reines is the fact that he ends up buffing the entire party with attack up rather than a single unit. So Waver works out better in either stall comps or comps that maybe rely on multiple damage dealers to handle different waves. And in that regard, I do think he's still a solid option, even though he is kind of outshined at this point due to his relative neutralness and adaptability, because you have other more specialized units for each card type. Still though, Waver's absolutely fantastic. We already talked about Dioscuri on the Valentine's banner. and we've already talked about Arjuna on his prior banner, so we don't have to cover them. But let's talk CEs now. So your CE right here is One Night's Dream. This is going to be a decent 5-star CE. It is split stats, but you kind of want that given the fact that it is a sort of survivability CE. It gives you invincibility for 2 attacks, and then NP generation rate at 15% and 20% even at MLB. So it is definitely an interesting CE for a challenge fight. This sort of thing reminds me of a lot of like Star Bomb CEs where you get stars on entry into the field. Same sort of thing when you get 2 times invincibility. It's definitely going to run out over the course of a fight, but it's there right at the beginning to help you get established and help you get set. So it's not a bad thing in that regard. And then you would at least still have potentially the 20% NP gen to carry you through the rest of the fight as a beneficial effect. So again, it's not the best thing out there, but it is a decent CE all around. Water Gun Battle is another interesting one, and this one's interesting for a different reason, and the fact that it is rare. So it is all attack scaling, and it ends up being both Buster and Quick Performance by 10%. But the real unique property here is that it is one of the rare CEs that allow you to ignore defense. This is definitely a harder niche to acquire in a lot of circumstances, and there are not a lot of CEs that give this effect. Comparatively to something like Pierce Invuln, there are plenty of CE options for that, some of which are even, basically welfare at this point. But basically, getting an ignore defense CE is somewhat rare. So this one to me would be the main attraction out of the CEs in the banner, as I think this could be very useful depending on who you stick it on. The rest of the CEs here are going to end up being your 4-star and 3-star CEs. They may be decent, but they're really not worth writing home about, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. And that is basically your White Day, aka Chaldea Boys event in a nutshell. So thankfully we don't have to talk too much about that, but we do have one other banner here, and that's the banner for Merlin. There's going to be a lot of questions probably this year over how good Merlin is, and I've talked about Merlin before where people seem to think that, he needed buffs and he's not that good. Remember that a lot of that sentiment comes from JP from before Koyanskaya and Oberon were revealed. People looked at Merlin as sort of the sole staple of the Buster system, and you already had Scotty in existence, you already had Castoria in existence, so it seemed like the other 2 card types were in a much better spot. So people were looking to maybe make, Merlin something like a 50% charger, or maybe give him some more increased capability in order to help Buster out. The reality was those other 2 supports were already in the pipeline, so they really didn't need to actually touch Merlin, and you can see they didn't touch him. I think that's well justified because Merlin to this day is still one of the strongest units in the game. A lot of people will tell you like, oh, well now we've got Proto Merlin coming out, so how much do we need him? Remember, Proto Merlin is arts. Merlin is Buster. Yeah, he's not going to be killed off by Proto Merlin, and there are some aspects that he still does better than Proto Merlin, particularly with regards to the NP. Again, having the triple arts deck is always just going to be something that's really strong for him. His, party-wide charge and charisma has always been solid. Proto Merlin has a little bit of an edge here in how that skill works for her, but it's not too big of a deal. He does get the invincibility for 1 turn. He doesn't get the drain effect that Proto Merlin does get, but the trade-off here is that he does get it on a lesser cooldown than she does, since hers is 8 turns. So he ends up in a little bit of a better spot, being able to get back to the skill sooner and being able to protect the party sooner. The only issue at play is Proto Merlin's skill is something that can protect you on a next turn, so it just requires you to time it right, but it can be very effective. Versus, again, basically having Merlin's skill just kind of being easy to use and not have to think about it too much. Proto Merlin's got that invuln right on use, but then the delayed charge reduction effect, and that sort of thing is kind of wonky, and usually it just ends up trying to buy you the extra cooldowns worth of time. But again, both are really solid in that regard. Merlin still has Hero Creation EX. Yes, it's not an arts up. Yes, it's not a tricolor buff, but it is a buster up for 3 turns. It also can function as a heal, as we have denoted many times, given the fact that it gives 3,000 max HP. So if you just need a spot heal, even if you're trying to use Merlin in something like an arts comp, it can still work. You're not going to get the buster up effect, but you will get the other 2 effects of the skill. And then the third part of the skill is that he gives 100% crit damage for 1 turn. The cool part about this is it's not Buster specific, so every single card type is affected by this. It is a very strong buff, and I think a lot of people have a tendency to overlook just how adaptable Merlin's kit is. The other downside, I think, to him compared to Proto Merlin is that Proto Merlin has 1 extra passive over him. They each share the Mixed Blood EX, but Proto Merlin ends up having a passive that grants just starting charge for no apparent reason. He just wants to be broken, I guess. Still, comparatively, you have Merlin's NP lasting for 5 turns. This is really nice. Merlin's MP, the only thing that scales on it is his healing. It is good. It makes Merlin one of the best healers in the game. It doesn't seem like it's that strong on paper, but you actually start to use it, especially in like something like a double Merlin comp. And dear God, enemies are going to have a hard time actually outpacing the amount of healing you'll be doing, since odds are you're going to be looping Merlin NPs over and over and over and over again. Even if you're just using the 1 Merlin, being able to get back to another NP is relatively fast since it gives the 5% charge, plus his already guaranteeable 5% charge every turn from his passive. Add in something like Prisma Cosmos and Triple Arts Chains, and Merlin just sits there kind of shitting out NPs all the time. This is why it's so difficult to kill a Merlin team, is because he is just so synergistic at keeping the party up with basically minimal effort on his end. It allows you to take sort of what should have been a defensive comp and turn it around into an offensive comp and basically start punching back against the enemies that are trying to kill you. And it's really, really solid for him to have that. Proto Merlin, by comparison, ends up only having 3 turns of max HP up. So you do get the effect of all the healing up front with Proto Merlin, but you get less of a duration on it. You also had the issue of Proto Merlin's NP will also scale the amount of charge she gives. This could be really good if you're going to roll for more copies of Proto Merlin, and certainly be something in her favor. But again, at the end of the day, she kind of actually needs the charge a little bit more. Her NP gain numbers are not as generous, and she kind of ends up just having a weird time sometimes getting back to an NP without some decent card choice. This is where I think they tried to rein Proto Merlin in, and where I think a lot of people will look at the 2 on paper and just assume Proto Merlin is stronger. Whereas the reality is, I still find Merlin easier to use than Proto Merlin in a couple of ways. And that is kind of why, is just sort of the minute differences with the NP and the way that invuln skill ends up working for both of them. Still, at the end of the day, I think Merlin is a fantastic unit. I highly recommend every player roll for him at some point, or Proto Merlin at minimum, just so that they have one of the variants. But still, Merlin on his own stands out as still a very strong unit, and he is absolutely the challenge unit of choice for Buster comps. Even when you look at Oberon and you see how strong Oberon can be, the second the fight doesn't wrap up within 3 turns, Oberon loses a lot of effectiveness. So staring at someone like Merlin can absolutely help you. And don't get me wrong, you don't have to use him only in Buster comps. You can use him in arts comps. We use him all the time in the Invincible comp, even though your unit may or may not be a Buster unit. And the reason for that is just how strong he is at allowing the party to get back to an NP and sort of acting as a spot protection while kind of keeping everybody topped off. So again, Merlin is a fantastic unit that basically doesn't need a buff still to this day. You still have the same CEs in this one, so it is what it is. If you just wanted the CEs and nothing else, this may be the better banner for some of you to roll. It just depends. We are now here with the Merlin summoning campaign that we already talked about. I don't believe the Road to 7 campaign oh, no, it does. So this year we're going to start getting Road to 7 campaigns. These campaigns are going to give you very difficult recollection quests. You could do the base recollection quest pretty easy. At that point, it's kind of the same as the original fight, but then they give you a 90++ variant of all of the fights. My disappointment with this issue is the fact that most of these fights are not actually more difficult. All they have done is inflate the health values to crazy numbers that make the fight mostly this just stall-oriented, unfun type of fight. A lot of the easy ways to get through it are to actually solo some of the fights, and I think that's pretty stupid because it just happens to be that a lot of the mechanics end up being very problematic when you can't deal with them effectively in a quick manner. That is to say, a lot of people's solutions for these fights was to defeat the boss usually in like 10 turns or less, because some of them have very annoying gimmicks. You start getting the gimmick to actually work itself out over the course of something like 100 turns, and it starts becoming a real pain in the neck, and you don't want to fail one of these like 50 turns in after wasting like half an hour. That's kind of the problem with it. Again, though, you don't have to do these super recollection variants. If you want to, you can. You will get 10 teapots. Those are nice, but remember, they're not the end-all be-all. If it's just not worth your frustration or time, by all means, feel free to skip doing the super recollection quest. I did all of these quests on my JP account. Some people are definitely going to struggle with them. It just is what it is. But I'm not going to say that they are impossible by any means. It just usually requires you to be somewhat ingenious with things. Again, one of the easy ways to solo some of them happens to actually be by throwing on like a bunch of healing command codes and then Made in Halloween, the CE that you should have gotten for free from the Halloween event that happened. That one will give you 75% increased healing, and you can kind of out heal some of the boss's damage in a hilarious way. But it's not going to work on every boss. It definitely can work though with units like Barghest and Balbon Sith on certain bosses. So just pay attention to that and the fact that that is a potential solution. Ivan is going to be coming back, even though we missed him for his raid in Tunguska. Ivan the Terrible is a decently, like, hard-to-get unit in that regard. Again, I do think he is a strong unit nowadays. When he first debuted, I actually didn't really like his kit. And the reason why is because he was a challenge-oriented buster unit that had NP gain as kind of one of his main gimmicks. And I looked at that and I said, that's nice, like, but yeah, if I'm not using him in a challenge, I'm just not going to use him for farming. He didn't have charge. He didn't really have a lot of the stuff that I would have liked to see in a challenge unit, but still, he does have some good stuff. Again, he had the ability to cleanse himself. He ended up having the Buster up for 3 turns, and he did end up having self-invincibility for 1 whole turn, definitely making it nice. But the real reason to use him, in my opinion, was actually that ability to remove all units buffs, which I actually think was really strong in challenge environments. That being said, clearly the devs kind of thought the same, that a lot of people weren't that enthusiastic about Ivan and didn't really want to use him, so they came back in and they, like, super buffed him. They ended up giving him 30% NP charge, as well as 2 new power mods of 30% for lawful and chaotic. I am going to say these two are somewhat diametrically opposed, but not entirely. That being said, you do see some rare cases. Well, no, actually, there is no case, to my knowledge, off the top of my head, of there being an overlap of these two yet. But there may be one into the future, so it is what it is. That being said, I do think that it's still strong, even if you take it at only a single power mod, having 30% extra damage. Always going to be a strong thing, since Ivan's damage was already tuned to the fact that it didn't have it. Again, though, I do think he has a pretty nice NP. He has had an NP interlude to help him out, and he gets the Buster Resist down of 30% for 3 turns after damage goes out. So subsequent NPs against the same units will hit very hard, and Ivan will absolutely be able to annihilate people in a challenge now, since you can automate him getting to his NP. Again, that was sort of the issue before, was trying to get Ivan to multiple NPs was not that easy. Yes, if you got the right cards with his NP gain skill pop, especially those arts cards there, you could potentially get back to an NP easy, but it was difficult to replicate, and it's one of those things where giving the unit charge just helps it out so much more, since it's a guaranteeable thing. But again, it is what it is, and Ivan is a very strong AoE writer at this point, arguably our strongest. We already talked about Anastasia, I believe, earlier during the Valentine's banners. Anastasia's come a long way. I do think she's still a decent unit, but I still want to see them give a little bit more love to her. Atalanta Alter is a very interesting 4-star unit. I am going to say that nowadays I can't really say that she's held up too well. It's not that she's bad by any means, it's that you've started to see units like MHXA just get crazy amounts of damage. Atalanta Alter in the flip side has not really gotten too much. She ends up getting the increase to the critical damage of her Buster cards for 1 turn, of which she does have 2. But at the end of the day, I don't really think that, you know, her kit really is that strong anymore. And the reason for this is the party-wide quick up of 1 turn that she shares with her archer counterpart. And again, just the single turn of evasion there that, again, I'm not going to say is bad, but it is what it is. So she doesn't really have any charge in her kit, she doesn't really have any way to secure multiple NPs, and you do largely rely on cards for that to be the case. However, my experiences of using her indicate that the cards are usually not enough to get her back to another NP, but again, your experiences may differ. I just feel like Alter could use some kind of buff at this point to allow her to be a little bit more consistent as a single target sort of boss killer. And it could start potentially with that second skill and giving it multiple effects, but who knows at this point. Talking about Avikabron's actually a lot stronger. I think a lot of people forget the fact that he has had an NP interlude, and that did make him very strong for an AoE 3-star caster. But odds are you're not going to be rolling this banner for him, so other than that PSA about his strength, we don't really need to talk too much about him. Salieri, on the other hand, is a story-locked unit, so some of you guys may want him for his rarity. He actually, in a weird way, can be a 3-turn arts looping Avenger for you, but his skills leave a little bit to be desired, and you'll kind of see why as we go through them. So basically, he gets arts performance of 3 attacks, 5 turns. Well, as long as you're not having to card, this is perfectly fine in a 3-turn. The issue at play is he might have to card at certain points. Salieri's damage is not exactly crazy good or anything like that, especially if you don't have a lot of NP levels of him, which is incredibly likely given the fact that he is story locked. So in that regard, you may just find yourself lowballing and needing to card, and if you accidentally oopsie and use an arts card before the 3rd turn, unfortunately, at that point, you're not getting all 3 of your NPs actually buffed with the 30% arts up. So that is an issue for him. I think they would have just done better to give him 3 turns of arts up, and it wouldn't have made him broken, but it is what it is. His 3rd skill here has gotten some love. They gave him the critical damage and star absorption, I think, to help with some of those carding issues. But at the end of the day, you could also see that his defense is also set to 3 attacks, 5 turns. So it's kind of intended, I feel like, for Salieri to be going up against 1 unit, but that may or may not be how you wish to use him, especially since it's not like there's a plethora of AoE ruler fights in the game that exist. Still, that being said, you can see his NP deals damage to all enemies and then reduces their arts resistance afterwards for 3 turns, something where, again, I think they're trying to hint at you using him more in a challenge environment. But hey, it is what it is, and I'm going to say that Salieri, for a lot of people, will just end up being that collection copy type of deal, and that's perfectly fine if you want to go for him. You'll just have basically the 2 rate-ups here, potentially, of all of the sort of low-star units, but then basically 1 banner for Ivan and 1 banner for Anastasia. You do also have the rare Heretical Yaga CE that was given to you for completion of LB1, but there's really no other way to get it other than like rolling story banner and such. So if you're maybe wanting to MLB this for collection's sake, that would be a reason to roll here, but honestly, the CE itself is not that good enough to warrant it. You will have new craft essences implemented here as well, including Phantasmal Princess, which, interestingly enough, bears worth mentioning due to the fact that it is a Berserker-specific version of Black Grail. I called them out at the time for making this though, because all this does is dilute the pool with a class-specific variant that is subpar. Yes, it doesn't have the negative aspect of losing HP per turn, but it trades that for losing 400 extra attack on the power of the CE on its top end. I'm gonna say that's not a good trade at the end of the day, especially considering how it is more restrictive. And this is the exact problem I find myself running into on JP nowadays. I've been playing JP for years. I managed to have 2 Black Grails at this point. but nothing yet to even come close to MLB. Meanwhile, even though it's a much newer CE, I actually already somehow seem to have 3 copies of Phantasmal Princess, making it closer to getting MLB despite being newer. This is exactly what I talked about with them diluting the pool more and just making more options available. Yes, it's technically more options of a Black Grail type of CE out there for you to roll, but it also means that you're less likely to get to MLB of any of the CEs in a specific amount, or again, just that it would take you longer to do so. And that's kind of the issue that I have with this. It's not a bad CE by any means. It's absolutely fantastic if you have a good Berserker to use it on. It just ends up being a source of frustration, I think, for people. Illusionary Confessional is actually worth noting just because it gives defense against melee enemies. Could have niche uses that would make it strong, but again, probably not worth rolling. And Paradise of Flowers ends up being sort of an improvement over the old Seal Designation Enforcer. So there are those CEs that are there. The Road to 7 project is basically going to be your stall campaign throughout the year. They're going to release several of these. You'll hear me talk about them during this banner review, but it is what it is. So again, just kind of look forward to this year having some definite dead time on it. Next up, we have Tesla Fest, and oh boy, do I have a bone to pick with the devs on this one. Tesla Fest represents a lie from the devs. That is to say, Mr. 2 years ago during one of his anniversary interviews with Famitsu managed to talk about the fact that they realized that a lot of people didn't like challenge quests in a lottery event. He was specifically asked about this with relation to the Land of Shadows lotto because people realized that there were no challenge quests in that one, and it was instead supplemented with a Grail front. And so that was the question that he was asked, is why weren't there challenge quests in it? And he said, people don't seem to like it. And this is actually true, I think. Well, I don't think people really have that much of a bone to pick with challenge quests in general. Having them compete with a lotto and needing to waste the time on doing, you know, like anywhere from 7 to 14 different challenge quests during a lotto, I think became a source of frustration for people that actually wanted to spend the time farming. Certainly, you have people that don't care about farming too many boxes, and that's perfectly fine. But to me, I think it's the best of both worlds if you simply just separated the two. And I think Mr. 2, when he made that comment, understood that. But regardless of Mr. 2 understanding that, years later, we have Tesla Fest now. And I'm reminded of the meme of, so that was a lie. Because Tesla Fest has 31 different challenge quests in it, including a grueling set of basically like coil type of gauntlet challenge quests where you cannot use the same unit twice, you cannot use a support unit, you cannot continue, and you basically are stuck having to use your own units. It becomes very difficult for free-to-play players to actually be able to have enough units to be able to tackle this. And it resorts to them having to solo things because they're just simply not going to have enough healing and sustain to get them through all the fights. Each coil is its own set, so thankfully you do get somewhat of a breather when you move on to the next coil. But it is a problem as you will have to complete 7 different quests using the same units. And if you fail, you're going to have to go back and find some way of making it work, again, with a different comp. So it's not exactly the best design they've ever done. I think if their goal is to provide challenge, it was certainly challenging, but I don't think it was very fair to the free-to-play players in that regard. And I think when you add this in with a whole nother set of old challenge quests, and then basically a actual event-specific challenge quest, I think this was just way too much and it was overload. I think it caused a lot of people to burn out on the game when it happened on JP. I think it caused a lot of people to complain. And I think that's why you have not seen this ever again since. So unfortunately, NA will have to go through this gauntlet, and it is sadly to come. But even with the Ilia Fest event that they had the next year, they did not end up doing challenge quests in the same way. Those challenge quests had 5 of the 6 units as a predetermined set that you had to use, and the only unit you got to choose was the 6th slot of your own. So they were a lot easier and less time consuming because you just kind of got to go through them and you immediately knew what the gimmick was and how to solve it based off of the units you had available to you. So clearly the devs realized that this was not a good design either after the fact. But enough about the actual Lotto event. We'll have time to talk about it when we actually do the Lotto guide for it. Regardless, let's talk about the summoning campaign for it. The campaign for the first part is going to be Tesla and Odysseus. And both of them we already talked about, so you should be aware of kind of how they work because we mentioned them during the Chaldea Boys segment. So if you're looking for the analysis on them, go back to that segment in the video and you'll see it there. But it is worth mentioning that you do have two other story-locked units here in Nero Claudius and Thomas Edison. Both of these are somewhat rare units. They don't get a whole lot of banners. And particularly as we start to look forward to JP and how the pity system is working and how things have kind of turned out over time, sometimes the 4-stars are more rare and harder to roll than their 5-star counterparts, ironically enough. You can manage to pull both of these off the SR ticket that's upcoming, but at the end of the day, I'm going to say if you actually want multiple copies of them, this is going to be your time to roll. So again, you can see that Umu is going to be paired basically with Odysseus, and Edison is going to be paired with Tesla, which is actually pretty appropriate, so I'm not surprised. So bear in mind, you're going to have to roll basically if you want one of those 4-stars with that 5-star. So that may influence your decision on whether or not to roll for them during White Day, or again, just how you kind of manage to tackle this. We do have a 5-star CE here that is Galaxy Karunos. That ends up being pretty decent. It's all attack scaling. It gives overcharge by 2 NP stages one time and increases the NP generation rate by 20% with NP damage up of 20%. This is all around just a nice CE with a little bit of that spicy overcharge right there on the outset for that first NP. But even once you use that, you'll still have the benefit of 20% NP damage and NP generation to help bolster you throughout the fight. So I don't think this is a bad CE by any means. Everything else here, probably not too worth mentioning, but we can at least mention the 4-star just due to the fact that it has debuff immunity for one time. It's not the only CE out there that gives this, but it is somewhat nice if you need it just on like the outset of a event. So again, let's talk about each of the 4-stars here that we haven't mentioned. So Umu, as we said, is a story-locked unit. She is AoE arts, and I do think that she's not the most loopable unit by any means, even though she appears to have decent NP gain on paper. She can somewhat struggle and need multiple supports to really help get the job done. But I think the biggest concern for you is going to be the Imperial Privilege and the fact that it just simply can fail. Losing out on 44% attack up can actually just be ball busting for you and completely destroy your ability to kill a wave if you're working with lower NP levels or just high health enemies that are already going to be difficult to overcome anyways. The good news is they did buff this skill and added on the 30% arts up to make it more consistent, so even if you fail the Imperial Privilege, you still get that. But that is, I think, going to be one of the major concerns with her. However, she does have Thrice Setting Sun, and this is going to be a big reason to get her for challenge content, as she gets a 3 times 5 turns Guts. Yes, that's right. She will proc Guts up to 3 times within 5 turns, making it a very strong skill at just making her somewhat of a cockroach and being able to stay alive and weather the storm. So really, really nice for her in that regard. She has had her NP interlude. She does ignore defense, so it does help her out. But again, at the end of the day, I'm going to say most of you are going to be rolling Umu just because you like her. And in that regard, she's certainly a serviceable and decent unit. She's not going to be your hardest hitting. She's not going to be your best looper, but she is still usable. Edison, on the other hand, I think just is still in a very weird spot. We talked about Osaka Behime and how I feel like the devs really didn't know what they wanted to do with her. I think Edison is another one of those units. I think Edison is just stuck in this weird sort of niche world where he's not really meta at anything. He doesn't really have any way that he truly stands out. And that's largely due to the devs not really giving him any identity for how they want to handle him. They've given him a bunch of buffs, including cooldown reduction. He is one of the few units that can do this, and he does have the ability now at this point to increase the party's NP damage for a whopping 5 turns. It's only 20%, but hey, it definitely counts. And he does have the ability to charge the party's gauge by 10% over the 5 turns as well. His third skill grants overcharge for 2 stages, so that has at least some niche uses. So again, he's not a bad unit. He just doesn't really excel too much at anything. And I think the real thing that holds Edison back primarily is the fact that he is relegated to this weird sort of niche pseudo support, because they just absolutely did not give him good damage, in my opinion. I think that's something they really needed to do, and so even with an NP interlude, he still is going to fall behind quite a few other AoE casters, as he ends up relatively more towards the bottom of the list rather than the top. Granted, his NP can have its uses with the skill seal and NP seal, but I digress. At the end of the day, if you want to use him, he's certainly usable, but I'm going to say he's probably not my go-to by any means, and this is one of the reasons that I actually have not rolled him myself on NA. I do have him on JP and have managed to use him a couple times, but usually it's due to me forcing myself to use him because I just want to see how he works again and kind of just reacclimate, rather than like me actually needing to use him. It is what it is. But again, he is a rare story locked unit, so there's that if you're just in the collection mood. Oh, whoops, sorry, I believe there was a second banner there. There was. So we have the Gil and Gil summoning campaign. Gil is just exceedingly strong at this point. We talked about Ishtar and how Gil and her have traded places, and it should be apparent to everybody that AUO, as we like to call him, basically just ends up being an absolute monster of a unit. They ended up buffing his charisma recently to increase the NP damage of servant allies with the Sky attribute and just kind of end up gaining him crit stars. Here's the thing, he's Sky attribute himself, so this also impacts him. So they basically just said, you know what, Gilgamesh, what you could use is 20% more damage, and that's why he was already strong even before this buff. He was maybe like the number 2 archer, probably the number 1 if you're up against servants. And it just, now he kind of blows a lot of people out of the water due to that. Because again, he's bounced around not even having this, rather than it being added years later into the game. I am surprised they haven't come back and hit his golden rule. I wouldn't be surprised to see at some point if they end up buffing this one and making it more like Drake's, where her golden rule also gives Buster up. So at some point they can absolutely do that with him, and it's the only thing he's pretty much missing in his kit at this point. So yeah, that would just be incredibly crazy if they did, but don't expect that until they need to pull that one out because somehow one of the fan favorites is not being too strong. Still, Gil did get his original buff that gave him 30% charge, and ever since he got that buff, he has managed to be just incredibly strong. Even still, Gil still to this day remains the prototype that I think a lot of further units are based off of. That is to say, when they brought Gil into the game early in FGO's history, they gave this man a ton of hit counts on his cards, and comparatively, most other year 1 units just have trash hit counts. This is where I think they kind of finally learned, and they said like, oh wait, Gil's performing very well with those high hit counts. Maybe we should start doing this to other units. And I think since then it's spread like wildfire. You still don't see too many units that have this crazy amount of hit counts, but still, yeah, it's definitely to his benefit to have something that the rest of the game has kind of migrated to over time, as it's just helped him, even though he's a year 1 unit, hold up very well down the stretch with his card performance. And then again, as always, you guys know, Gil basically has super effective modifier to pretty much all servants. There are very few enemies that actually have Enema Elish nullification, and it's easier to list the ones that have the nullification rather than people that actually have the weakness trait to Enema Elish, because there are just infinitely more of them. Still, highly recommend getting your hands on Gilgamesh. He is a fantastic AoE archer, and you will never regret going for it. His only downside is he does not have any survivability whatsoever, so you will need to find another way to protect him. Gil Caster, on the flip side, has had his ups and downs. He starts out as a very good unit and a rival to Tamamo. Then Tamamo gets buffs to kind of hang with the big boys, and Gil Caster got left behind there. He still had a decent niche as kind of a premier star generator, as his NP being a 10-hit NP. Still, a 10-hit NP had the capability to, again, have a crazy amount of stars generated from it. And that's where we kind of see him being used in a lot of things early on. Nowadays, though, Gil has had to get a buff here that now increases the party's charge by 20% and increases his own by 30%. So this makes him somewhat like Taigong Wang, where he's got that 50% charge for himself, but everybody else gets 20%. This is not only going to help him loop, but this is also going to help the rest of the party get to their NPs. So he works really well in multiple different setups. He can work well as your devoted damage dealer, he can work well as a support, and he can work well as somebody that's just helping out another damage dealer get to a NP to be able to kill their wave while he maybe handles his own. So he's the epitome of good, popular new design now thanks to this, and it really does help him. Again, he does still have the party-wide charisma and is one of the only units in the game that increases party debuff success rate. You don't see this too often. Most units focus on buff success rate, so it can be useful in some niche scenarios for this, but obviously the party-wide arts up of 30% for 3 turns is strong in and of itself. So again, Gilgamesh is a very malleable and adaptable unit, very versatile. Highly recommend getting Gil Caster because of that, even if it's just as a like sort of backup support in case you need to get away with a lesser rarity in terms of party cost, or you just need another option for your group. So ironically enough, this is going to end up being the Surtur recollection quest in this one. This one's particularly annoying. This is the one that I actually did end up soloing with Baobon Sith with Maiden Halloween. So again, let that be a little bit of a tip for you guys that want to run through it like that. But again, just briefly to note, all of your recollection quests are going to end up with these same rewards as always, so it is what it is. For the summoning campaign, this is going to be a return of OG Scotty. Now, with Clairvoyance, we now know that OG Scotty has Summer Scotty coming as well to help complement her. I've talked a lot about the dichotomy between the two of those. Like, a lot of people said that Summer Scotty is just OG Scotty, but better. I do think there is some truth to that argument, but it's not a one-to-one thing. There are some things, obviously, that Summer Scotty does better. And then there are some things that OG Scotty does better. Like, for instance, being able to protect the party that Summer Scotty doesn't do at all. So there is that I think is going to be worth it for her. But I do think one of the drawbacks to using OG Scotty at this point is just in order to gain the benefit of that NP, you have to use resources to get her to that NP, which means that you probably weren't using cards or charge skills on another unit that could have been popping off and getting to their NP to basically kill off the enemy. So it is what it is. Definitely, it's something you'll have to weigh in the moment and basically say, like, do I value getting to the NP and killing the enemy before it kills me, or do I value staying alive? But at the end of the day, there's not much you're going to be able to do about that. You're just going to have to go with what, cards you're dealt. OG Scotty is highly useful, and there are quite a few arguments for getting her. Even though you do have Summer Scotty coming up, having OG Scotty in your court is going to allow you to basically have another option. So not only will this allow you to form potentially triple Scotty comps down the line if you get both of them, but it also means that in situations where you can't take a support Scotty, or you don't want to take a support Scotty, that you can still have a double Scotty set up for your damage dealer that is probably quick. Means that you could provide basically all 3 supports with, basically the original Scotty and then Summer Scotty, and then end up having someone like Oberon as a 3rd support there with your unit and not having to rely on your supports, like your friend support at all. So there is that. And I do think that alone is certainly worth something. It's kind of immunizing you from being able to fall prey to that trap. But at the end of the day, I do think original Scotty could maybe use at least a little bit more tweaking, but it doesn't have to be anything too serious. And it definitely probably won't happen, assuming there is at some point another quick support out there in the waiting. Still, I think the ability to have the quick performance up for 3 turns and the critical damage of quick cards for 3 turns is good, because remember, Summer Scotty, while she does have quick up of 3 turns herself, has crit damage of Buster cards for 3 turns. One of the real, like, wonky things that I don't like about her. I understand why the devs did it. They did it so that units that are quick can have both their quick and Buster cards buffed, to allow them to maybe crit down a wave without having to use their NP and refund back to full. The issue at play there is that's not always going to be consistent, because it's reliant on card RNG, and so while I understand what they're trying to do, it definitely means that if you want to be able to crit hard with your quick card that has all the card type buffs on it, probably are going to want OG Scotty. So that is going to be the downside to just trying to get Summer Scotty without OG. You're going to have a tough time pulling off any quick crits with something like that. But hey, it is what it is, and I'm going to say at the end of the day, the NP interlude that they did give her, while I think it missed the mark for what I want to see, I do think in the future, if original Scotty has some way of getting to her NP, that this would actually be a very good buff for her. But in the interim, without an easy way to get to the NP, this still looks like it's a little bit weird, and it just looks like they tried to give a new effect basically to the NP scaling so that you had a reason to roll multiple copies of her. That may or may not be the case, but we'll just have to see over time. Again though, highly recommend getting your hands on Scotty, as she is a meta support, and even with Summer Scotty coming out, there will still be reasons to have the original. Next up here we have Brynhildr. Brynhildr ends up being in a interesting spot at this point, mostly due to the fact that Enkidu has just gotten buffed out the wazoo. So Brynhildr has always had the beloved niche that is very wide and allows her to definitely get a lot of extra damage against units that she would already be effective against, be it archers or berserkers, you name it. So again, she definitely has always had that kind of working for her. She did end up getting the 30% charge skill that really helps her out. This allows her to be able to forcibly 3-turn, but we also now have, you know, Scathach basically having 20% charge on her end, and we end up having also now Tamamo Lancer herself having 30% charge. So it definitely is becoming a lot more commonplace. It's more of a case of like an arms race between all the single target Lancers. And in that regard, Enkidu is still winning, so we kind of have a weird spot at play. That being said, her being Buster is to her benefit. This does mean that you can pair Oberon with her and actually gain the effect of Oberon's Buster up. So there's definitely that's going to help out her damage. So I do think she is a very stellar unit still on JP, even though you don't see her getting used too often. I think the big reason for something like this is the fact that she is a limited unit that just does often not get a lot of banners. She is somewhat rare for a limited unit. That being said, this has been their case on JP as they're now trying to run more banners. You're now seeing them kind of trying to work all their limited units back in on a yearly basis. And I think that's a good thing. So it'll remain to be seen how her future availability is, but I do like Brynhildr still. So if you like her, going for her as a single target option for your Lancer category, I don't think you'll regret. Next up, we've got Sigurd. I see a lot of people, you know, really dislike Sigurd or kind of like think that he's weak in some regards, and I think a lot of people are missing the forest for the trees on him. And the reason why is because while Sigurd is not a perfect unit and he does have some issues, a lot of people get overly obsessed with NP damage numbers as always. And the reality is Sigurd's strength is not his NP damage, and it never has been. So the people that are looking for that, yeah, I can certainly hear that you might want to get Sigurd a buff, but he has had them, and at the end of the day, his real calling is his crit damage. And this should be apparent when you look at his crazily high attack stat. Sigurd, for a long period in time, was tied for the most attack power among sabers with Proto-Arthur. And it was only until Ibuki ended up coming out that he finally ended up getting passed. So in that regard, he has always had a really hefty amount of attack for making his carding hit hard. Combine that with his 3 attacks, 3 turns, 100% crit damage skill, and yes, people crying about his NP damage, I have straight up seen Sigurd crit for like twice as much as his NP. So at the end of the day, this man has the capability of just carding you to death. And I think the people that get overly obsessed with his NP damage are again missing that aspect to him. Certainly, like I said, the NP damage could be a little bit better. I think a lot of the criticism comes from the fact that he has the dragon niche, and a lot of people comparing him to someone like Sumanai, aka Siegfried. Siegfried's a very good unit, but at the end of the day, still what Sigurd is going to have is the ability to deal decent damage, not maybe world-beating damage with his NP, but also have the capability to follow that up with just some crazy high damage crits. And I do think that really works to his favor. So again, he's a limited unit. You don't have to roll him by any means, but I do think he's pretty interesting in that regard, and I have used him exceedingly effectively. The big thing to me that Sigurd could use at this point actually ends up being a star soaking skill. He has generation and he has crit damage, but he doesn't have the ability to soak necessarily. Granted, with Buster units nowadays, if you support them properly, you could basically flood the party with stars. So I don't really find that to be that big of a concern anymore. We already talked about Napoleon. We already talked about Sitonai. So the only one left here is the Valkyries. Valkyries are in an interesting spot. I think a lot of our 4-star AoE Lancers are. We had a period in time in FGO, like pre-Melisson, where a lot of 4-star Lancers had the capability to kind of surpass their 5-star counterparts. And the reason for this was most of them are permanent and kind of desired units. You had units like Melt Lancer, you had units like the Valkyries, even units like Parvati out there that just people really liked and wanted to roll more copies of. Even if they didn't, maybe in the course of their other rolls, they got spooked by some of them. So people having a high NP level of a 4-star AoE Lancer was not uncommon, and in a lot of cases, due to the relative damage parity that we've had in the AoE Lancer category, there really was not that much separation between the 4-stars and the 5-stars, such that you couldn't just outperform the 5-stars. I do think this is also largely the case with the 5-stars not getting nearly enough buffs, but at the end of the day, this is where Valkyrie really thrived and lived. Nowadays, though, Quick's in a little bit of a weird spot. It's not that you can't use the Valkyries effectively, you absolutely can, but still, I'm gonna say a lot of people are trending towards either Arts or Buster units, and I kind of see why when you start looking at the overall refund and damage numbers of the Valkyries. The Valkyries were a unit that I feel like were overly penalized to the presence of Scotty. I think the devs reacted very negatively when they started seeing the Scotty numbers on paper. And so when the Valkyries were coming out, I assume they just said, all right, we are not giving them a crazy high attack stat. We are not giving them a ton of steroids just to kind of keep them reined in. Still, I get it, I understand, but I'm gonna say their performance could be better. In fact, I can argue that their summer variant is infinitely better in terms of loopability and damage output comparatively, but it is what it is. So I do really like the Valkyries. They are permanent. I'm gonna say you don't really need to roll for them, but they're not bad and they are serviceable as an AoE unit, given the fact that they do have the charge over time. Just don't be bamboozled into thinking their overcharge effect is actually good. It's not. It's really not. It's instant kill against demonic enemies. There are a lot of things that are demonic, but if you're fighting servants, this is just odds are not going to proc. So at the end of the day, it's only going to be useful against non-servant enemies. And it probably will not land on anything that's, you know, silver rarity or higher. So it just depends. Again, you guys can see the sort of schedule here. You're going to have the Valkyries on rate up alongside every single one of these units. So if you like the Valkyries, more power to you. You will also have the 4-star CE that was given to you upon completion of LB2 here. So again, if you guys are collecting, this would be how you would get it. But again, nothing too much to write home about the CE itself.